So we are delighted to be interviewing Dr. Eve Poole, who's had a varied career, to say the least, starting in the Church Commissioners with an early job, and has recently returned as the third Church Estates Commissioner, with a major responsibility ranging from pastoral reorganisation to cathedrals and business investment. Eve has worked as a leadership consultant, has written from a theological perspective on business ethics, leadership and capitalism. And she also has the tantalising title of the first female chairman of Gordonstoun School, where famously Prince Charles was educated, which we'll come to later. So Eve, you have a fascinating and beautifully designed website, if I might say, which we highly recommend. evepoole.com? I can't remember this morning. And we noticed on the site under your name, you have written three words: confident, courage, and character. And we're going to be exploring why you value those three things: confidence, courage, and character. But at the beginning here, as this is an interview with an oral history format, can I ask firstly when and where you were born?
I was born in Creighton Hospital in St Andrews, which is now the headquarters of one of the golf courses there. And I was the third of four children and lived in St Andrews until I went to university.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, we found it helpful to ask about maternal and paternal grandparents. So before we come on to your parents and how they met, what influence do you feel your grandparents had on your family and you?
Really big influence, and going back further than that, I'm not quite sure if you can see it because it's sort of literally behind my head, but that photograph is my great granny. Oh, right. And it's her graduation photograph from Aberystwyth University in 1910.
Oh my goodness.
And she was one of the first graduating class of women. So it's a family that has quite a lot in its background. She herself and her sister-in-law went to university, and so that raised an expectation that we would not let the side down by not going to university, as 3 out of the 4 of us were women. And she had been brought up at Hampton Court Palace because her father, I think, was the secretary to one of Queen Victoria's cousins. So she had written a play, a version of Alice in Wonderland in, I think, the 20s or 30s or something. And was quite a sort of bookish individual. And in my early childhood, we still used to go to her house, but eventually she moved in with my grandparents in Oxford. So we used to visit her, and she'd be sitting up in bed in her 90s doing the Times crossword and holding court. So she was quite a figure, great granny. And those grandparents were also really interesting. My paternal grandfather had been one of the Florey lab. It was part of the penicillin lab, but they specialised in the research that led to finding out about Christmas disease and haemophilia. So he had been an army surgeon in the war and was an academic surgeon thereafter, working in Oxford through St Hilda's. And he'd met my granny, who'd been a nurse. She did a lot of work in family planning in the early days. She herself was one of millions of children with an alcoholic father who owned one of the pubs in Banbury. So it was quite an interesting social mix, let's say. And great granny apparently sent for elocution lessons quite early doors. So I think there were always some tensions. And they were quite a chaotic family. They had 3 children. My father was the youngest, but very welcoming. And we used to trip across people all over the world who'd sort of stayed in that house in Carlton Road. And one of Grandpa's best friends, actually drinking mates, was Colin Dexter. So he again was very much part of my childhood in Oxford, coming to visit with the third of the triumvirate, who was a Greats professor at Trinity. And they used to meet together for drinks every night. So there was a massive mixture of sort of influences there. My maternal grandparents, my grandfather had been an engineer in the RAF during the war, but I think it had quite a nice war because most of the memorabilia from the war we had from him were opera programs from Italy. And he was a customs and excise officer in Perthshire in Scotland, but loved climbing. So he was a Munro bagger and was off every weekend climbing, leaving my granny with the children. She had 3 girls. again, all of whom went to university. So my parents very predictably both went to St Andrews University, met there, got married, like every other single person that goes to St Andrews University. So that's how they met. My granny, that granny actually also was a teacher. She went to Goldsmiths and taught English. So even though both grandparents had become, both grandmothers had become housewives by the time they had families, they had both been professionals in their background, which was probably quite formative as well.
Gosh, what a rich background. It sounds like it wouldn't have been untoward if you'd become a hard-drinking Oxford Don research scientist who wrote crime and science thrillers on the side.
Absolutely, well, those early days.
Early days. Fantastic. Thank you. And anything in particular about your grandparents that you carry with you as you? I mean, you've got that lovely photo in the background, which tells us a little something about your great-grandmother's place, but for your grandparents, do you notice a little of them in you and what you do?
Definitely. I mean, we were lucky enough that we had all four of them and my great granny until I was probably early teens, and then they all started dying off. So we did, because we didn't have huge means as a family, most of our holidays were spent with them. Granny in Perth was obviously not very far away from St Andrews, so we probably saw her the most. Her husband was the first one who died, probably when I was around 8, actually. But we used to spend every single summer, the first 3 weeks of the summer holidays, we'd spend in Oxford with those grandparents. And so we knew them very, very well. And huge influences, really. I mean, Dr. Grandpa, that's what we called him, the one in Oxford, was sort of a communist. He used to sort of sing communist songs very loudly. He loved PJ Woodhouse. He drank a lot. He looked after Granny, who had been agoraphobic, and actually then bizarrely had a stroke and forgot that she'd been a sort of alcoholic chain smoker and got a new lease of life quite late on. But that had been quite complex, I think. So Dr. Grandpa looked after everyone. And was incredibly generous and smoked cigars incessantly, and even more so when my brother started collecting all the cards from the packs. So they were just very much part of the sort of fabric of our lives, really, and an awful lot of the things they held dear about family, about literature, about history, about music, you know, an awful lot of these things and crosswords and friendships, you know, became really important. Granny in Perth was very much a sort of organising person, and she would just cook up a storm and amazing meals all the time, and she kept cats and had an amazing garden and was a real homemaker. Was also expert at dressmaking and knitting and curtains and upholsteries. Whenever you went to her house, she'd redone everything with a new William Morris design, or, you know, I've still got jumpers that I wear in the winter with holes in them now that she made for us. And I think she'd had quite a hard time, you know, through the war and through bringing up these children pretty much single-handed while her husband was up in the mountains. And so she was a very stoical survivor. But again, she was always going out to night classes. And one of my memories is getting sort of Christmas presents of, you know, pottery things she's made, and she kept learning. So again, I think a love of learning was something that I very much picked up from both sides of the family.
Lovely. Now, you mentioned Banbury. When I was first married in my early 20s, I lived in Yarnton. Was it Kidlington for 18 months?
Yeah.
And I must admit, Oxford and Oxfordshire sort of passed me by due to my evangelical churchmanship that was a little shy of intellectual pursuits. So I look back now at a younger me and could give myself a good slap for having missed the opportunity to take in much more of Oxfordshire and certainly Oxford. But I mean, it's such a magical and special place. And if you return there, it sounds like you went there in the summer several years. What are some of your memories of Oxford?
Well, they lived in Summertown, and we thought it was only there for us because it was Summertown, and we only ever were there in the summer. So I was, from a very early age, I was quite confused. I thought it was some sort of Brigadoon magic place that only sort of convened for our convenience. And we used to get the bus into town. So I didn't know the town centre that well, really, because we were very much pottering around and walking down by the river and, you know, going to the trout and things. And so we were very much at that end of town. And it is quite funny now. My two two of my siblings ended up at Oxford University, and one is still there. He's the senior tutor at New College these days. So there probably hasn't been a year when I haven't been to Oxford since I was born, pretty much. And my best friend lives out in Headington now. So I've got to know lots of different aspects of Oxford, and that's been a real treat. And in fact, we used to take Granny out to Banbury to go to her favourite bun shop and to sort of drive past the old pub and things. So I know the villages a little bit. She had a brother who lived out there, and we used to go and visit him. He was a very extraordinary person, and yeah, she'd had a very large family, so there were lots and lots of them scattered around in those villages. So we used to go and troop around and visit them. So lots of extended family there.
Lovely. You mentioned the trout in passing. So any American friends I have who get to visit Oxford, I'll obviously send them to Christchurch, but we'll say, watch this episode of Inspector Morse and then visit the trout pub on the river.
That's what I wrote. I did one of the eulogies at Colin's funeral, and it was what I said is the thing I love about the Morse books is they've written down and preserved for me so much of my childhood, because all of those places and all of the pubs in particular, we would be in the pub garden having lemonade and Walker's crisps while Dad was inside having a pint with Mum. And you know, all of those places and the music and the pints and all of that stuff was very much my reality when I was there in the summers. And so I adore watching both Morse and Endeavour, because it feels very real still to me. Apart from the dead body.
That's just too good to lean into that a little bit. So I'm assuming you'd be in your late teens to early 20s when Inspector Morse was in its heyday.
Yes, I think so. I mean, we do remember when the books first started being written, because Colin would always give Grandpa a first edition, and they sort of started mounting up on the top of this particular cabinet where he would always put them. Two of them are dedicated to him. One is dedicated to me and my sisters, largely because we, at my grandpa's funeral, where Colin was obviously very upset because one of his best friends had died, we sort of kidnapped him and persuaded him that it'd be a really good idea to dedicate one of the books to us. And so The Secret Annex 3 is to Lizzie, Anna and Eve. And he was such a kind man, Colin. He used to keep a really close eye on my granny once Grandpa had died. And she did like to drink. So even in the nursing home, he'd sneak in. She had a favourite tipple, which was one of these old tumblers used to get with mustard in them, free from Coleman's, and she would have half gin and half Cinzano. So he would sneak it into the nursing home for her, and they would have a high old time.
That's fantastic. Oh, what a lovely remembrance. Thank you. Moving on to your parents, can you tell us a little bit more about them in terms of how they met and what they did?
So my mum is still alive. My dad died rather young at 56. My dad was the youngest of three, and I think was a bit precocious, and I think it created some sort of tensions in the family. He had a big sister and a big brother. The big sister went to Oxford School for Girls with Miriam Margolyes and became a sheriff in Edinburgh. A very grand lady, very much in the tradition of her grandmother, my great granny behind me. The middle brother ended up being a professor of sociology and management, very, very successfully, wrote a lot in the early days of HR. But I think my dad was quite smart, because in those days it was quite problematic. I think it was all to do with tests rather than ages. So he was actually in the same year as his brother, who was older than him. And he'd got in on scholarship to Magdalen College School in Oxford, whereas my uncle was fee paying. And I think they were rivals their whole life, and that was tricky. They did love each other dearly, but they competed like mad. And because each of them had 4 children, that then meant that we all were hugely ambitious and competing. And even though we're all great mates now, you know, there was a tear in our childhood to be a sort of newspaper cutting sent up from down south about what the cousins had done, and we had to sort of try and match and do better, and likewise. So that was a sort of extraordinary backstory in my childhood, was the sort of ambitious, competitive nature of that side of the family. Very, very intellectual and very, very bright. My dad was a classics teacher. He'd applied to Oxford University when he was about 16 and not got in, and so he'd sort of sulked and ended up at St Andrews. I think he was maybe 17 or something, and did classics, and then did teacher training. In those days, St Andrews and Dundee were the same university, and then he married Mum. I think Mum was in her second year. She always has a joke about her grades suddenly getting rather better once she got married. And so they lived to begin with in Dundee and then back in St Andrews. And he spent his entire career teaching classics in state schools in Dundee, which, as you can imagine, maybe when he started was quite normal because Latin was still a core bit of the Scottish curriculum. But as the years wore on, it became quite an esoteric thing to be doing. But one of the lovely things about his funeral was the sheer volume of people who had come from some quite difficult backgrounds in Dundee, and because of Latin had managed to get into Oxbridge, through the entrance tests and things. And so it had a totally different life than they would have had without it, which was something I hadn't really appreciated as a child. We were just sort of forced to do Latin as a matter of course, and never really thought that it might be a tool of social mobility in the way that it had been in Dundee. He was also a poet. He wrote a lot of poetry, was brilliant at cards and chess and all those things, had a real gift for friendship, a very loyal friend. The church when he died was absolutely packed. It was raining and there was people outside everywhere. There was the bishop and the homeless man, the big issue seller, and people from all over the place, because he'd sort of pottered around town in and out of the pubs chatting to everyone and rescuing people. And we always used to wake up in the morning, there'd be some other waif or stray at the breakfast table with sort of needle tracks up their arms, sort of half dead in the corner or whatever, that he'd sort of met on the way back from the pub and sort of rescued. So he taught me a lot about Matthew and about seeing Jesus in the stranger, and just hospitality and generosity, really. And his heart just gave out when he was in his 50s, but I can see why, because he was a very big-hearted man.
Oh, beautiful. So this sibling rivalry, other than press cuttings, how overt was it, and how much did you have to intuit from family dynamics?
My father had got ahead of the game having children first. So from 1969, pretty much every year there was a Poole cousin born. And I think we had two before they had one, and then we had another one, and all that. So there was always someone ahead of you to sort of benchmark against. And a lot of the same pursuits. We were all very keen on music, did a lot of music. And because my uncle was in academia, he was slightly snotty about his little brother, staying in the school system, having never made it into proper academia. So I suppose it didn't feel, I think speaking to my cousins, I think it felt more negative at their end. I think for us, it was a bit like sort of having sort of pace setters in a race. It just felt like we all had to keep up. It wasn't sort of anything bad would happen if we didn't. It was just, about family honour and about, doing the best we could because of the opportunities we've been given. So I found that quite positive. But, we did have Dad coming down in the morning going, 99%? What did you get wrong then? And we'd feel really cross about it. So I definitely
room for improvement.
I definitely inherited from him this sort of obsession with perfection and never giving up. And that is a massive tyranny. But it comes from a good place. It's just that it takes quite a lot of unlearning. And I think makes me a terrible person to work with often, because I have that sort of 99% in my head. I know exactly where it came from, and it can feel very unkind, because there's often a lot of reasons why people didn't get that 1% right. And it's not all to do with just being idle.
But when you tell that anecdote of your father coming down the stairs, I can see the joy on your face. So it sounds like it was more a joyful spurring on than some austere you'd failed him in some.
Yeah, he was always incredibly rude about women, but he had three of us who were, incredibly well educated and did well. So you could sort of, I think people who didn't know him very well would find it very easy to write him off as sort of sexist and very sort of antediluvian in his values. But you could see the twinkle in his eye when he was taking the mickey out of us. And I think it's because he wanted us to do really well. And, being a teacher, he knew the sorts of things he would do in the classroom to try and encourage people and keep them going and keep them going on. In fact, all of us were taught by him variously at different stages, because one sister did an extra, in Scotland you hire rather than A-levels, she did an extra hire in Latin on the side that he did with her. And I got some coaching from him for a Latin exam I had to do. And he was an incredibly patient teacher. I've really remembered that when I myself have been teaching through the business school, is trying to remember that patience, which, he wasn't a very patient man, but when he was in teacher mode, he was incredibly patient. And it was good to also learn that toggling, that you can deploy those skills even if they're not your default, as long as you call them to mind and do that so deliberately.
That's wonderful. And often it's been amazingly true in many of these interviews, not always so, that parents have married people that they've been very different to each other in terms of temperament. So how matched were your parents?
Such a good question. I mean, they sort of met at a dance, I think, it's the sort of typical 60s thing. And there would be no particular reason for their worlds to collide. Mum, one of three girls from Perth, very sort of middle-class family. Dad quite sort of gothic in his background and sort of young buck who was rushing about. But they suited each other so incredibly well. I think everyone thought Dad wore the trousers, but I think Mum probably always wore the trousers, really, and I think we all knew that. She kept home with these 4 children on a teacher's salary, which was really quite a hard thing to do. And it wasn't until we'd all pushed off to school that she developed her own career as a genealogist. And she was just always there and still is, incredibly loving, but very firm, very much like her mother, strong discipline, but held within a very loving frame. So there wasn't very much room in our family for sort of mucking about. We were all fairly deployed and busy and focused, which I think, my dad had a massive work ethic too. I mean, he never missed a day of work apart from when he had a cricket ball in his eye and ended up in hospital for a day. But, there was a sort of value about that, that both of them embodied. We didn't really have days off sick because that was for wimps. So I remember at Ashridge doing this exercise about the drivers, the sort of Eric Byrne stuff, and realizing I had absolutely all of them. You're only supposed to have about 2 or 3, but the be perfect, be strong, all this stuff, which I think is why I'm such a driven person. And I think that was very much both of them in partnership. And I think Dad dying so early has been really massive. I mean, my granny was widowed quite young as well, so Mum has that templating to follow. But it has been very disfiguring because they were such a good partnership and very strong together. Yeah.
So if you carry, I hope I'm not overlaying the word on you, a slight perfectionism from your father, what trait do you think you carry the most from your mother?
Gosh, that's a very good question. I think the be strong is from Mum. I think we probably both have a very high pain threshold apart from anything else. And we don't really suffer fools gladly. I think Dad was much more sympathetic. And so that has huge strengths because it makes me very invincible on very many levels. But there is a hardness about it, I think, that I didn't see in Dad in the same way. And I don't think it's a hardness in Mum. I don't get that off her. It's not a sort of judgmentalism, but it is a sort of a carriage, a way you you orientate yourself. Because if you're bringing up a family of 4 children on very little money, you know, you do need to be a survivor, and you do need to get through miscarriages. I mean, she did a lot of volunteer work with, you know, all the beaten wives and all of that stuff. I mean, every university town has tragedies that aren't really talked about, and very strong in the church community as well. So there was quite a lot of sort of coping I've got from her, I think.
Thank you. Now, if we can go back to your childhood, are there any other strong memories that you have, or general impressions from when and where you grew up that stay with you? When I ask that question, think back to your childhood, what comes to mind?
Well, St Andrews is an extraordinary place to be brought up. I mean, it is everything. You know, it's highly international because of the university and the tourism. The university gives it a sort of cultural and educational tinge. The golf, the beaches, the history. It's also very safe because once they closed down the train station in the 60s, you know, it's slightly cut off. So it felt like it was a really dream place to be brought up. I mean, we would just open the door in the morning and get on our bikes and play in the streets with all our mates. And I think you can be a bit soppy about these things, but I think looking back, it was fairly trouble-free compared to an awful lot of childhoods that I now know about. I mean, it wasn't without its tribulations. My dad, because he was in education, felt very strongly about and sort of not wimping out. So we went to a pretty rough primary school, which was really important because we were all bullied, of course, because we didn't have a telly, we didn't have a car, we had sort of, my dad was English and all that sort of Scottish stuff. We were snobby and boring, but actually, who wasn't bullied? And that stuff, it does make you paranoid whenever you get anything you perceive of as bullying, you know, you overreact. But it teaches you an awful lot of really important stuff really early doors, and also being at school with everyone, not just all the sort of posh university kids or whatever, means you have to really learn what people are like and what different families are like and different households and backgrounds and values. And that was really, really important. And then we just went to Madras College, the local state school, which again was a really good mix, people being bussed in from the farms all around and huge mixture of kids all together. So that was really important. I think, particularly living in Edinburgh now, I think the statistics are like 1 in 4 children go private. I mean, it's quite high percentage wise, but it means you're buying into a social echelon at quite an early stage, and therefore you get insulated, and you don't tend to encounter people who aren't like you, really. And my parents, you know, probably through circumstance, really, because of the money and whatnot, you know, we had that very broad exposure. But because my dad was friends with everyone, we also just had an extraordinary in and outflow of people coming through the house, and you know, bizarre sets of godparents. I mean, I had a godmother who was an academic who'd written books, so that taught me about people writing books. And I had godparents, one of whom had been a sort of heiress, with sort of rich people abroad and sort of titled people in her family, and you know, a husband who'd actually been at Gordonstoun, it turns out, who was sort of an independent person who worked in Royal Naval Reserve as well. Then I had an extraordinary godfather who taught at the university. He taught Arabic, essentially, and he was a very troubled person in many ways, was an alcoholic for most of his life. But he taught me so much. He was really quite extraordinary. Not only did I discover he'd been sort of involved in the SBS and all kinds of subterranean stuff that, of course, you sort of end up finding out through the back door, but he had come from a very different sort of world. He'd been born in Darjeeling, and had sort of moved over to Britain when he was about 6 and never really gotten over it, you know, the lack of nannies and all that kind of thing, and being privately schooled all the way through. Yeah. And therefore had massive issues around emotional life and women and all of that stuff. And but so he bought me books. He used to observe the anniversary of my christening. He thought birthdays were a bit rubbish. So every anniversary of my christening, I'd get another book from him, or some jewellery from Garrard's. He was very keen on that kind of thing. When he died, he was engaged simultaneously to 3 different women, none of whom knew about each other. And he was just an extraordinary person. And I learned a lot from people like that. There were lots of very large characters in my childhood, which also taught me about the importance of eccentricity and difference, which I really try and keep remembering in this very monochrome world.
Yeah. So, not sure why this question comes to mind, but you're a teenager in the 1980s. What was, I suppose, because I've been watching the latest season of The Crown, how did the 1980s hit St Andrews without its train station and tucked away? I always think of, movies and music at the time. I guess it's the soundtrack of The Crown. My wife and I sit there and go, oh, do you remember? So what was something?
Yeah, there was a lot of puffball dresses and crimped hair and sort of discos and all that kind of thing. It all felt rather innocent. I mean, we had Fife Aid when they had Live Aid, which was a big thing. And I remember we always had a fairly early curfew because my parents were so old-fashioned. And we'd gone out on the bus to Craigton, near where I was born, to the park there for this Fife Aid concert. And I remember having to leave early and feeling really cross, but still being able to hear Fish belting out all those songs from Brilliant as I came back home. And so I got home and immediately leant out my window and I could still hear it. So again, it was a lot of sort of clarting around town. There were a lot of us. We all went to school together. I think there were private schools. I mean, the St Leonard's, the girls' school, and there were lots of private schools in Dundee, but pretty much everyone went to the same school. So you didn't have that you have in many places where there's this school versus that school. So yeah, lots of just hanging out. And of course, you've got the beaches and the golf courses. So there's lots of room to sort of run around. And there was still an independent cinema. So we used to go there a lot. Yeah, that was fun.
So where I grew up in council estates and went to state schools and wondered why every English teacher seemed to be Scottish in the education system in the UK. Mrs. McCullough was my favourite English teacher, and I did find it strange that my English teachers had this almost impenetrable accent. So are you bilingual as a result of biracial? Yes. What's your Scottish?
I did have a very funny day once where I was doing Thought for the Day on BBC Radio Scotland early doors, and then I was doing a slot on Women's Hour at lunchtime. And I felt a bit embarrassed listening back to it because, of course, I was very broad Thought for the Day because I've been listening to Scottish voices in the sort of run up to it, and then it's your turn and you're not going to suddenly, oh, good morning. But then when you're on sort of Women's Hour, it's quite sort of RP really, comparatively. So I think I've always had that ability to switch, and it was really quite important in the playground to stop you getting kicked in. So you get good at that quite quickly. Dad expected us to speak properly, but if we'd spoken properly in the playground, that would have been a problem. So I have to watch it a bit because I went to America to school for 6 months on an ESU scholarship when I was 17, which again was an extraordinary experience. And I had to be very careful I just didn't adopt an American accent fairly randomly, because then I would have lost my distinctiveness. So I think I end up now having what you can hear now, which is a fairly middle-of-the-road accent. But it tends to shift depending on where I am.
I know, but I quite understand that. My wife appalls me spending too much time with my brother because when I come home, I
can't understand a word you say.
Broad Lutonian accent, and I still to this day she cringes when I say the word. I've got some vestigial things I can't get rid of, so instead of new, I will say new, and it drives her mad. But then she's a Geordie. So she's got this complete southeast of England accent, but when she spends time with her parents, again, the words that I just don't understand half. It's like a foreign language when they get going. And
that's such
culturally, isn't it? How that works.
Natural ability to tune in and tailor, and so much of that is about jargon and vocabulary. And I find when I was teaching at Ashridge, one of the tricks was to try and pick up the vocabulary very quickly. And if you could use the company's vocabulary back to them, you would become an insider really quickly. So I think I learned a lot from that sort of alien behavior. And I think probably a bit like you and your wife. I mean, certainly when my husband's been home or I'm on the phone to my sisters, there's a bit of sort of recalibration required. But I think as long as you're not just trying to sort of blend in a rather feeble fashion, but you're actually doing that genuinely, it's fine. But I think it can come across as disconcerting if people meet you in a different register.
No, cultural attunement, it's a vital, well, a survival skill for you. You said avoiding a kicking at school, but especially your teenage years. I mean, I don't know what my real accent would be, but I spent time in a National Youth Orchestra. I mean, I had a wonderful experience, peripatetic lessons, but quickly learned that to fit in with a very different demographic compared to my school, I had to learn to speak differently. And if I didn't switch my accent back when I was at home with my friends, I could get a good kick in as well. So it's like all my airs and graces. So
I saw this really visibly one Hogmanay. My brother was at university at the time, and he brought all of his Oxford mates up for Hogmanay. And of course, Scotch Hogmanay is not like English Hogmanay. It's not sort of dinner parties and ball gowns, but of course, all these people from Oxford had come up with all their, finery and champagne and all this, which again, you put your drinking trousers on in Scotland, you don't muck around. So they'd all, it was getting near midnight. Will had managed to keep them hidden in the house for most of Hogmanay, but everyone wanted up to go up to the bells. So all of these sort of, posh Oxford types in their regalia sort of paraded up to the centre of town where everyone gathered. And a fight broke out around the fountain with some locals. And I think a few of them ended up in casualty. But anyway, it was broken up by my brother because, of course, he realised that most of these people he'd been at school with. So he immediately switched register, got Fife accent on, and said, "Hey, is that you, Jimmy? It's Willie!" And all of a sudden it's went. And it was really interesting seeing this Oxford Don suddenly reverting.
Fantastic! I could just picture it. So, I'm sorry, I'll press it a little more onto the Scottish thing. So, with Brexit happening, I am suddenly very interested in my Scottish grandparents.
Yeah. Good.
And hoping for Scottish independence and a Scottish passport and Scottish citizenship at some point. But that's my own working out of what's going on with Brexit. But suddenly I'm very interested in my Scottish antecedents. Do you consider yourself Scottish or English? Who do you
Scottish. I mean, I would have always said British as a matter of form because my father was English and we spent so much time with his parents in Oxford. But over the years, I've definitely become Scottish. And I think it's a particular tragedy, this whole Brexit thing for me, because we were brought up in a fishing village essentially, and literally the tiles were brought in from the lowlands on boats as ballast, and so there are so many links with mainland. And of course, you're taught Scottish history, you're taught about Mary Queen of Scots and the Dauphin and all that, and Scotland has had links with mainland Europe for many, many years before it ever really had links down south. And the union is really recent. When you start looking at Scottish history, it's kind of a bit bizarre to have a union with England and wasn't something that had been particularly traditional or encouraged, whereas the Scots have always had very strong links abroad. And so it just feels odd to me. And I think that's why Brexit has boosted Scottish independence, because I think we feel much more naturally aligned with mainland Europe than we ever did with England. And personally, I'm married to an Englishman. My kids were born in London when we lived there. We are British. I mean, most of my antecedents are English rather than Scots. But I feel ethnically very Scottish and feel very committed to that.
Yeah. And as that, again, let me phrase the question this way. What sense of Scottish identity? Because as an Englishman, I actually don't like English identity. I've always envied the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh. There's been that hard drinking St. George flag sort of thing that that I just sort of never warmed to, and Morris dancing and all those sorts of kinds of things that we have in England. So I've sort of envied it. But what was it like for you having that around you and able to have that as an identity? And how has that changed over the last few decades?
It's very structured. I mean, you don't notice it until you're not in it anymore and you're aware of other educational systems. But I didn't study English literature apart from Shakespeare until I went to school in America. That's when I read Pride and Prejudice and Wuthering Heights, all that stuff. In Scotland, I remember doing Burns recitation and Burns singing, from the age of about 6 or 7, and all the history we were taught was Scottish history, all the literature. It was indoctrination. I mean, we were singing, Scots Way and all that, and you don't realise till later on that they're very anti-English songs, very deliberately so, and I don't know whether that will have changed by now, because I think with fresh eyes, when you look back on that stuff, there's something a bit dodgy about the sort of relentless nationalism. But we just thought it was really normal. I mean, it was just like what you did, and everyone could do country dancing, and everyone could do all these basic things, and there was definitely an identity. And I think in places like Wales, they're doing a lot of that through the language, and there is an amount of it, but it doesn't, because my cousins ended up living in Cardiff, so I know a little bit about how they were educated over there, and there is a bit of sort of indoctrination, but it feels a bit retrofitted, whereas in Scotland, it just felt like it was the air you were breathing. And it was only when you weren't there anymore, you look back on it and think, oh God, you wouldn't get away with that nowadays. And I don't know, I think there's definitely a chippiness about it. I mean, the Scots have always been fighting. They're fighters, really. And then they sulk and they emigrate and go to Australia or Canada or something if things don't quite go their way, and then prove themselves. I think there is a fierceness about the independence of the Scots, which does make you aware of the underdog and aware of being slighted. And, we are acutely aware of our history, the clearances and all that stuff. It still feels quite real. So it's a different perspective. And I think that's what I had to notice when I went to university and then lived in England, that actually the English, until all this Brexit stuff and everything, the English didn't think about Scotland. It wasn't particularly relevant, whereas we spent our whole time struggling, and they were just like, what? So I think there's a bit of that going on, which is interesting. And so I think now that the English is struggling, the whole Brexit thing, we've been doing that for years.
Fascinating. Now, you, in a humorous and self-deprecating way, you're on record as referring to yourself as a well-behaved 1970s girlie from Fife in the east of Scotland. So you've mapped out some of your roots to us. How let me just pull all these things through and ask you, how have those roots, including the ones we haven't talked about, how have they been positive for you, and where have they maybe been less than positive? That question makes sense.
I think there were a couple of key influences. One I haven't mentioned was my aunt, the sheriff, who had herself learnt to be a chameleon, because she'd come from this very chaotic family and gone to Oxford High School for Girls, and I think that was possibly through the good offices of a very famous godmother who had a tiara that she kept in the bank, who'd been disappointed during the war and had horses. And so there was a sort of posh thing going on there. And whenever we met my aunt as a child, we were always terribly intimidated and on our best behaviour, because she never married, had this very glamorous lifestyle, rushing about, travelling, going to New Year concert in Vienna. She'd inherited the tiara that she kept in the bank. She had all these dinner parties and drinks parties with all these very famous people, politicians that she'd been at university with, who were now running the country and all that stuff. And so again, we had to shift register. We were quite often called in to be sort of waitresses and things like that for those kinds of dues. And then the godfather I mentioned, the one who was engaged to all those women, he had rowed for Cambridge. So he was a member of the Leander Club and therefore the Stewards Enclosure at Henley. So every summer, the first thing we did in Oxford was Dad would go to Henley Regatta, just because they'd been losing members in the 60s, and so he'd been corralled in by my godfather Jacko. And so there was a sort of fast, direct route into very established British echelon type behaviour that I was able to move into when I needed to. And that sort of shape shifting actually ended up being incredibly important, because I think there is Fife is a very small place, and in spite of the university and the tourism and stuff, there wasn't very much ethnic diversity here. For instance, I didn't really get to know any Black people until I was at school in America. We had an Italian family, we had a Vietnamese boat family, we had a Chinese family. But it was a very sort of old-fashioned 1970s sort of setup. So apart from the fact that through school and church, I sort of was mixed in with all sort of different class sort of echelons, that sort of being able to carry off the posh thing was actually really important to have learnt that very early, because there are still, as you'll know, very many places in Britain where you just, it's like Cinderella. She couldn't have got in without the dress. She had to wear the dress to get in because she didn't have an invitation. And I sort of learnt that quite a lot, quite early doors. There's something about knowing what the passports need to be and figuring out how you do that with integrity. So I think the limiting factor was just that it was a very small environment. But because I went on scholarship to America, because I had these links in through my aunt and through some of the intellectual links we had through the family and other families that we knew, and sort of personalities, I sort of could glimpse other worlds that gave me a way into them when I moved into them later on as a grown-up.
And did you have any experience of church growing up?
Yeah, so we went to All Saints in St Andrews, which was built by Lady Younger of the brewing family, and she'd been very worried about the morals of the fisher folk. So she built this mission church, for them, right by the sea, and lots of windows with the Andrew and James Everly fishing, and a boat hanging from the ceiling, and lots of ironwork that looks like nets, and it's a very much a fishing church. And it was a great congregation. It was a mixture of, one of the guys who was church warden had been one of the masons who built it. One of the other church wardens was the local fishmonger. We had ladies who'd been in service. We had professors. We had a massive mixture of people. And I was baptized there on Easter Eve. Said Godfather, Cambridge had won the boat race for the first time in a long time, and he dropped me because he'd been celebrating. So that very much just part of the oxygen of my life, really. I went there, Sunday school, and then as soon as we got big enough, it had been an all boys choir, boys and men. But the new vicar realised that wasn't really going to last, so he came. I remember him coming round to visit, sitting in a deck chair in the garden and putting it to my dad that in one fell swoop, if you could have the 3 Poole girls, then they would go mixed. So we then joined the choir, and that was a hugely important part of my childhood. We sang religiously. It was quite high church, so lots of services, even songs, and high days and holidays. And the church paid for us to go on RSCM courses each summer, sing in the cathedral in Edinburgh, and again met lots of children from all over Britain through that. So we all sang to quite a high standard because of that, as well as the other music, and that was it's a great way to learn about God, because you're there doing a job, so there's no question you're not going to show up and do it properly, but you get a very interesting perspective, and you also do all the funerals, and you do the weddings, and you do all that stuff, so you learn a thing or two being in the choir, and that was really important.
So, say, as a self-described well-behaved 1970s girly from Fife, what was your faith journey like? Was it a well-behaved one that you received?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a very boring cradle Christian. I mean, I got to the stage where I was prepared very well for confirmation, because we had a very classic vicar there who was a real old school type. So I knew all about liturgy and prayer and all that. And I suppose I didn't have a particularly deep faith at that point. It was just normal behavior. But then when it got to university choices, I remember, I mean, I knew I had to apply for bloody university. I knew I had to be Oxford because both my sisters were there, and, you know, even great grand had gone to university. So I was sort of sat there with perspectives thinking, oh God, I've really got no idea. My best subjects were Latin and maths, and I couldn't do Latin because my dad did Latin. That would be boring. I looked around the rest of the people in my maths class, and I don't want to go to university with people like you. And my sisters were already doing law and English, so I couldn't do those. And so I was kind of looking through the perspectives thinking, oh, I can't even do archaeology because I never did history because I was being recalcitrant, and did geography because my sisters had done history. And I remember reading the entry on theology and philosophy, which was something you could do jointly at Oxford in those days, and thinking, well, I know from my sisters that all you do is stay up all night wondering about the meaning of life, and it'd be great if you get grades for that. So maybe I should do that as my degree. And in those days, of course, you could apply for both Oxford and Cambridge if you did a choral scholarship. So I thought, ha ha. So that's what I did. And I did actually get a choral scholarship from Cambridge, but I failed one of it was a step Latin thing I had to do because I'd been at school in America. I just was behind. So I missed a grade on that and ended up at Durham. And I think it's very kill or cure doing a theology degree. You know, it's a bit like, you know, butchers don't eat their own sausages. I think you learn about the Bible, you learn about faith, you learn about Christians and Jews, and in fact, Durham is such a brilliant course. You learn about other faiths too, and you do a big number on philosophy and ethics. And I mean, what a rich degree. I absolutely adored it. I would do it again 20 times, just do different options. And for me, that was it. That absolutely solidified my faith and has made it absolutely unshakable. And you know, I've got a lot of issues with whether I believe in the Church of England, but I certainly believe in God and Jesus, and I'm very clear on that stuff.
Yeah. So yes. So I like this way of choosing a degree, something that no one in the family's doing. Were your parents like? So we your wider family as well, like, oh, that makes sense. None of us have done that. Or were you was there any puzzlement were you the first person to read?
I think they just thought it made sense. I mean, none of us had ever done any of that stuff because I think in England you can do an REA level, but I don't even think that was an option in Scotland. I never noticed it on the curriculum. You know, you did a bit of sort of stuff like that in first, second, S1 and S2, but it wasn't a subject you would do exams in, really. So I think they just sort of thought, particularly because of my dad, you know, university was entirely about education, and it was about knocking yourself out if you want to. I mean, he did have a fight with my sister because she wanted to go to music college, and he was quite adamant it had to be university because you had to have a proper degree. So that was a shame. She ended up, slightly out of revenge, applying for the hardest possible subject in the hardest possible college to get into in the whole world, and and of course got into all of that. So she's now a judge and doing rather well, but and still is a musician, of course. But so we had to have a degree. That was the bottom line. But it didn't really matter what it was in, as long as we were going to love it and really get cracking, because it was about.
And Durham was acceptable.
Oh yeah. I mean, we had relatives that were teaching there. I mean, my parents were in incredible pains not to make me feel like a sort of Oxbridge reject, because of course my dad was an Oxbridge reject, and he knew exactly what that felt like. And so there was an incredible amount of overcorrection to try and make me feel okay about that. But I mean, come on, that's why I went to do a doctorate in Cambridge, because I had to even the score, really, because then my little brother went to Oxford.
Well, I was going to get to that later and ask if there was a compensation, and the family honour was restored on the scoreboard of life and academic achievement. So when you're obviously, so you know, I know Durham a little. I've been to some research seminars there, and it's still an amazing place today. And must be. I've always thought what an amazing place to study theology. So beyond the interest in the topics, in terms of your own faith, do you have any particular moments or just things in general where the doing of theology brought your faith into focus in the way that you mentioned to me a moment ago?
I had a couple of really great influencers there. My academic tutor was Jimmy Dunn, the New
Oh
Testament.
my goodness, was it?
And he was a great encouragement to me because, of course, because I'd done classics and I'd done Latin, I'd done a bit of Greek. Of course, I did Greek as well as a bit of Hebrew. And of course, I was very good at Greek because New Testament Greek is easier than normal Greek. And so he was very keen that I take that on. So actually, I ditched that after my first year because of another key influence there who I'm still in touch with, Anne Loades, who I think is best known for being a feminist theologian, but she's so much more than that. And she opened my eyes in an extraordinary way because she taught us philosophy and ethics. And she would spend hours by the photocopier, and we would have these reams of just extraordinary things to read. And she herself had been very embedded and very involved in an awful lot of thinking on, human fertilization, embryology thinking, and all of stuff on gender and childlessness, and a whole lot of other things like that. So I did courses with her on not only sort of philosophy more generally, but also on bioethics and sexual ethics and all of that stuff. And I'm still in touch with Anne. She's an amazing woman. And I think I got more interested in what they would call their modern theology than biblical theology, partly because of just how extraordinary she was. And there was also a rather extraordinary man called Hume who did Christian approaches to other faiths. And so I learned a lot about how other people have tried to explain God in the world, which was, again, a very important corrective, so I didn't get arrogant about my own faith, because I happened to be born into it. If you happen to be born into Hinduism or Islam, you're not going to suddenly apostatize randomly. There's a whole load of stuff going on there about what you've been exposed to and what therefore truth is in your context around religion. So that was important. So I think it wasn't so much a kind of blinding moment in the cathedral, although you get those from time to time. It was more a sort of steady formation around sort of locating myself in that world and really thinking through it. And I think the thing that was so valuable is theology at Durham, because I didn't want to discourage people who had genuinely been called by God, the entry requirement was 2 E's. So, most people had to be quite bright to get into Durham, but if you did theology, so the front row was the sort of, old Etonians whose parents had been able to buy them into quite a posh school, but not necessarily buy them any brains. And so they were just there to get the degree. And so, they sometimes showed up, quite often in last night's DJ, reeking and a bit pie-eyed. And then you had the sort of future bishop's wife's brigade, the proper county ladies who'd sort of done RE at A-level and thought it would be a sensible degree in order to find a husband. And then you had all the ordinands, both Catholic and Protestant, actually, or whatever you'd call it, Anglican. And then you had people like me who were just curious. And so we had such fights. We had all these seminars on the resurrection and, and some people were really fighting for their life because it was their vocation for this stuff to be real, whereas some people were a bit pissed from last night who couldn't give a toss and just wanted to have an argument about it. So my goodness, you learn how to debate and you learned about how to really understand what you believe and why and how to explain that well to other people. So I just think everyone should do a theology degree. I think it's just so formative.
Well, very different than my theology experience because I went to London School of Theology. So everyone was earnestly, it was multicultural, but everyone was, and mostly older. And I didn't become a Christian, didn't go to a church till I was 17 and ended up there at 19. I was horrified by church history the first 19 years old. But I do remember some of the lecturers and the influence that they had on me. I must admit, it was only later in life, and I'll get to your PhD, but for me, sort of evangelical approach to theology of, learning enough information about things we already know. I was far too pragmatic when I left, and it's sort of, I missed the opportunity to really do theology with some amazing lecturers. So you're
still time. I'm gonna do it again. I'm gonna do it.
So what a great advert. Do it again. So I might apply after that description. Now, if we take a little step back in your education, you've already mentioned Madras College and its founder, Dr. Andrew Bell. So this is a state comprehensive with an unusual name and interesting pedigree. Could you and some of its educational methods? Could you tell us a bit more about it?
Well, by the time I was there, it was a fairly vanilla Scottish school, but its antecedents were really interesting because it's called Madras because Andrew Bell had set up a school, I think, called St Andrews in Madras, which was very much based on a pedagogy where the teachers would teach the older kids and then the older kids would teach the younger kids and the younger, all the way down, which I'm sure used to happen in village schools where you had lots of mixtures in the same room. And so for many years, that's what Madras did. There was also a school called Bell Baxter, and then there was another one in Fife. He'd founded 3, I think. So it was very proud school. And if you visit St Andrews, it's right in the centre of town. It's a very old building with an old chapel, Greyfriars Chapel, a sort of medieval ruin at the front. So it's very imposing. And therefore, it was a sort of really proper traditional Scottish school that took itself terribly seriously and was very strong on, the arts and classics as well as all the sciences and things, with huge traditions of sort of debating and math challenge and all theatre and all these sorts of things. So it was a pretty pucker school, and I mean it's quite funny now knowing more about schooling because of Gordonstoun and other places. We really lucked out. I mean, it was a fantastic school. My father would be disparaging about it because he reckoned that they sent all the kind of the washed out teachers there to recover because it was so jammy, and they were naturally getting people into Oxbridge every year without even trying. It was just normal behaviour. It was a testament to what Scottish education used to be like. I think it was very rigorous.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, I probably should have asked you this question earlier. It would have fitted in better. So the Scots are traditionally known for a high respect for education, and certainly this was my impression when I was younger, being more egalitarian than the English. And you've wonderfully mapped out some of talked about posh environs that you've had to access. Are the Scots as egalitarian as we?
There is and again, it's very hard to abstract because I think things have changed a lot, but it's definitely in the heritage. I mean, if you read about Rabbie Burns, I mean, his dad paid a manny to come and do a private school for all of them because it was entirely normal that farmers sent their children to university, ultimately, but certainly to school. And so there was just a tradition in Scotland that everyone got educated. It wasn't a sort of, thing you only did for certain children, which was more the case down south, I think. And Scotland had about 8 universities when England only had 2. And so for all those hundreds of years until they produced Durham, there were stacks of them north of the border with, frankly, very few people. So I think it's just part of the culture. The whole sort of chippiness, I think, and feeling like you're on the back foot all the time means you need to use everything you've got. And I think education was always seen as a really vital tool. As well as something that would help you read your Bible, because there's a lot of that. I mean, the religiosity in Scotland runs incredibly deep, and a bit like the sort of ethnic Catholicism in Ireland, it's still very much there, the kind of wee free feeling when you travel around the Highlands in terms of there were an awful lot of pubs in St Andrews that would only serve half pints because they didn't really approve of people drinking whole pints, And when you go around the Highlands, there would be sort of, well, I've got a bottle of beer. So there was still a lot of that when I was growing up. Absolutely nothing open on a Sunday and early closing, and everyone going to the Carrick, and that's very much part and parcel of it. So the egalitarian thing, I mean, I think because of the clearances and because of all the sort of history, and because there are actually very few big communities in Scotland compared to England, because it's just a much smaller country, if you are in a big city, there's lots of different communities there. And I guess you could say that about Edinburgh and Glasgow, but for the smaller places like, Perth and St Andrews and whatever, everyone was just rubbing up against each other all the time. So I didn't understand about class. It wasn't a thing that I knew about. I think kids learn about it earlier now because often the schooling split happens earlier, and there's a whole load of rules about who you can play with and who you can't. I mean, I remember there was a bit of a frisson once because I went missing after school because one of my pals had persuaded me to go home to her house. And of course, I was only about 6. And, in those days, of course, you all walked to school with your siblings, so there was none of that. And there was a slight sort of frisson because I was eventually discovered. I think I did walk home eventually, but my parents had got the police out and everything. And it had been on one of the estates in a slightly less safe part of town, and all that. And I remember a bit of a frisson, which I didn't really understand at the time, but I think I understand better now. But of course, as kids, we were just pals with everyone. But my dad knew everyone in town, and I remember there was a dad that came up to school to try and kick in the headmaster once because the headmaster had been rude to his lad, and we were all sort of locked in the classroom looking out the window. So, it was quite a mixed bag. And I think my parents were concerned that we were safe, and they knew because we told them that we were all bullied and stuff. So as girls, that's not as bad. But my brother used to get kicked in a lot, and he generally hid that. But I remember one time he wasn't able to hide the amount of bruising he'd got, and that's when my parents moved him to a different primary school, actually. But there was a wee undercurrent there, because maybe we didn't notice those differences, but I think other people did more than I did. Maybe I wasn't as aware as I should have been of that.
I mean, that sort of leads me on to my next question, staying with your adolescence. I remember the bullying I got at school because it was a strange time, the 1970s, when the government provided peripatetic music lessons, which I loved. And so I loved music and reading. And I just stood out like a sore thumb on a council estate.
Not cool. You should have been playing football.
It wasn't very cool at all. Yeah, I should have been playing football. Exactly. But, and I remember this will lead me to my question. I remember how painfully shy I was because there wasn't anyone I could share my interests with, for a start. I remember reading the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and the Chronicles of Narnia, and I think my friends are reading Dan Dare. But you've described your adolescent self as you've described yourself as a desperately shy teenager. But you've obviously developed some self-assurance for the career that you have, and you've told us about your parents and how you've brought some of those with you. But how did you go from this shy adolescent to the confident that you are now on TED Talk?
Hang on a second, I'm going to show you. So this is the Jackie Annual, 1975.
Oh my goodness!
Which actually I bought in a charity shop, I think, in the 80s. And I remember I was desperately shy, and I remember sitting in my bedroom thinking, this can't go on. I've got to figure this out. And there's an article in here. I've especially ordered this on the internet from doing a speech.
Oh my goodness!
Because this literally was the thing that changed my life, because it had. Let me read this to you. A girl can't successfully pretend she's slim when her hips are robust 40 inches, plain for all to see. But confidence, or lack of it, is personal, not a physical quality. You can pretend to be a lot more confident than you are. In fact, you can keep on pretending long enough, you'll get so good at it, you'll actually be more confident. And of course, that's not news, but it was news to a teenager in Fife. And it's very hilarious. There's all these things like boys are human too. You can do it. You can develop confidence more quickly than you can develop a perfect figure.
So did you go over this article, underline it? Did you take?
Yeah, I did. So it was this thing.
Think, right, here's my 3 things to do.
Yeah. I remember cutting it out, and I had it in a little drawer in my bedroom, and I just decided I was going to fake it to do the fake it till you feel it thing. And I think I'd learned a lot from my sisters. One sister had developed, she'd reacted to the whole sort of bullying and weird thing by just having a couple of very close friends and just screening everything else out. The other sister tried to assimilate by changing her accent, learning how to play football, being trendy, getting a haircut, Princess Diaries style, all that stuff. And I'd been lucky. I'd been in the first bit of primary school, the head mistress, Miss Thompson, had pulled me out to look after some of the kids who were there because their parents were on sabbatical from foreign universities. So they needed to be palled along. So I would get that job in order to rescue me from the playground, because she could see. She used to sit with her tray in front of the door and look at the playground, and so she could see what was going on. And it was another teacher's child who was the bully, and so it was quite difficult to deal with that, I think. So she used to come up with all sorts of ruses to get me to come inside and help, and also to do special reading classes. So I'd done a sort of combination of both my sisters, really. I'd tried to develop some chameleon skills, and I'd also just ploughed my own furrow. I had a few particular friends. But then when you get to secondary school and there's just all these hundreds of people and you just don't know how to navigate it and you get lost. And it's so easy to, you know, as you've learned from your primary school experience, to become the sort of bullied. You need to figure out, how can I hold my own? How can I develop a carapace? And so that's what I did, really. I just decided I was going to get more ballsy about it. And yeah, and I think the culmination of that was when I went to school in America, because of course, when I was at school in Fife, everyone knew my sisters, and they were starting to know my brother as well. They knew my parents. So they assumed things about you and your interests and your experience and your ability. So you weren't really your own person. But if you go away to school in America where nobody knows you, and it's the pre-internet, so you have one call every week with your parents on the phone and that's it, and the odd letter, you have to know who you are and you have to become who you are fairly sharpish in order to, you know, figure that out. And so that was the sort of acid test of all that stuff I'd learned from the Jackie Annual.
It is. I mean, I remember going to sixth form college. It was so liberating to go somewhere where most people, mine was huge, about 2,500 students, but it was, you know, the cool kids weren't cool anymore.
Yeah.
And you could just reinvent yourself. You could be this person that you know, you hadn't been able to grow into because everyone at school remembered you when you were 10 or 11.
Yeah. 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 I think what also was really useful about my very varied upbringing was that I just met a lot of very different sorts of people. And these days when I talk to leaders and I talk about imposter syndrome, I mean, all leaders have that. And the trick for me was always to find yourself out first, because you're vulnerable if you're faking it. You're vulnerable if you're pretending that you're amazing and wonderful and fabulous, because someone will find you out. But actually, if you're able to confront your flaws quite early doors and be clear about what you can do and what you can't do. Like I'm rubbish at PE and games and stuff. I always was. There's no point in me trying to learn football. I mean, I practiced with my sister to help her, but there's some stuff I was never going to be good at. And actually you just need to sort of come to terms with that. And I think I was lucky to have a really supportive family and some things I was good at, where I think I probably learned that quite early. And that's really served me, is just not trying to fight battles I know I'm going to lose.
I mean, I still look back at photos of my childhood. I was about 6 foot tall when I was 11 and towered over everyone, but was bullied.
Wow.
You know, you think, I wish I could go back to my younger self and say, you do realize you could crush them like insects.
Yeah.
But you just
see the fear, don't they? That's the thing, is they see the fear,
is.
and you need to figure out how you're not going to let them see that, because it doesn't matter how much you assimilate. That's just a pack behavior that people go for the weakest because they can pick that up. And that, I think that's probably why I'm such a toughie, is that I just never wanted to feel like that again. But I'm aware that, you know, that has downsides too, because pretending you're invulnerable and hiding weaknesses and stuff comes back to bite you, doesn't it? It
does. And when in a bit, when I get to ask you about leadership and what you do there, you know, some of your work on fear and anxiety, I'll be asking you about that, because it carries it. You know, we carry on with that long into life, don't we? Not just school. I mean, you've wonderfully described some of your tutors and family and people that stood out for you at university. Is there anybody else who was a big influence on you, especially at that stage of life, late teenagers, university? Anyone mentoring or inspiring you? Anyone in the Jackie magazine?
It was mainly sort of extended family, really, and teachers and stuff. I was very inspired by some of my teachers in America. It was quite a different deal, really. The teachers, there was a sort of simultaneously bigger sort of power distance, in that people would stand up when teachers came into the room, and it was always very respectful. But maybe it was also because it was a boarding school, and so you were sort of living on site with an awful lot of them. It was as though they had permission to engage with you as a person as well as with the topic that they were trying to teach you. So Miss Weaver, who was the music teacher, Mr. Ackerson, who was the ethics teacher, and Mr. Service, who was the English teacher, they all spotted the slightly out of water Scottish person, because the ESU scholarships, they did them every year. So they'd have people coming in just for 6 months. You had to be able to integrate really quickly to get anything out of it. And I was cripplingly homesick. My first couple of months, I was in really bad shape. And lots of people noticed and tried to help because I was a long way from home. And that was really, really tough. But it was very good to have had that experience before I went to university. Otherwise, I would not have been able to get as much out of theology as I did. So a lot of those teachers, I remember a lot from what I learned in America, probably more so in that very short period of time than I would be able to recollect from quite a lot of years at Madras. A lot of big influences on the music, particularly all the people that taught and played at church. We had a succession of different music directors, and because it was one of the churches that a lot of academic theologians came to, that also attracted some really interesting people who would get involved and preach. And we had an extraordinary combination of a moral philosophy professor and the organist, the city organist, who was at the university, who used to write musicals for us. So we cut our teeth on Joseph, and then they wrote musicals on Damascus Road and Babylon and The Birthday, and that was amazing. As a teenager, we sucked in a load of people from school, so that again was sort of cool points, being able to do kind of rock musicals. So they were a huge influence, because we traveled a lot with music, really, in terms of what we were able to do and be. So they were also a big influence, I'd say, too.
Oh, lovely. So your first major job after leaving university, Durham University, was with the Church Commissioners. So what was the state of the organisation then as a Christian body, as it was adapting to the modern business world?
So the Church Commissioners...
this is the early 90s, the 93, yeah. Isn't it? Early 90s, yeah.
It was 93. So in 1990, there had been a massive headline in the Financial Times. John Plenger had blown a story about the Church Commissioners losing 800 million from their endowment on...
Yeah.
So by the time I got there, there'd been a huge amount of...
so 800 million then?
So it was about a third of their portfolio, just under a third. In those days, they had about 3 billion. So 800 is really quite a large percentage.
In real money today, I mean, that was nearly $1 billion then. Gosh.
Oh, gosh, yes. I mean, it was big. And it was because of... it's one of those things where you can look back and you can go 800 million. But of course, they made it back within about 3 years, because pretty much everyone else also made terrible decisions on property, and it was a very bad time in the markets. The commissioners were overexposed, and the bloodletting meant that they had to do some really deep work on the whole structure of church financing, because in those days there was pretty much still bankrolling the church. I remember I did a secondment down to the Diocese of Chichester, and the average giving there, the richest diocese in England in those days, was 97 pence a head, which wasn't even a pint in those days. Because there wasn't a culture of giving, there wasn't that, you didn't think about it, you didn't join the dots, really. So it was a very, very different world. Commissioners were professionalizing very quickly. They were having to do some actuarial work on pension obligations, which of course many companies have had to do since. And it became very apparent that the commissioners were what the church was living beyond its means in a big way. So I loved, there were some bad things about it, obviously, but I loved the time I was there, because it was a hotbed of creativity. They were creating policy groups on this. They were trying to sort out their IT and sort out communications and sort out ethical investment. And there was a whole load of really cool stuff happening. And the civil service, the commissioners used to be a civil service department deep down, so it still had that kind of structure and ethos. And so I was brought in as a sort of direct entry fast stream person with one other girl, and we were immediately whizzed around, sort of being on groups to help with all this big strategic thinking. So it was an extraordinary opportunity for a new person straight out of university to really get into the bloodstream of what was really going on. So found that very exciting. I mean, it was a pretty old-fashioned place. It was mainly sort of bishops' godchildren, people sort of trying to explore their vocation, at leisure, and a slightly sort of mixed bag of people. And they pretty much halved the staffing overnight, which says quite a lot about what it had been like before. They'd finally got rid of the tea lady and stuff like that. So I was there at a great time. There was still a lot of dead man's shoes, which is ultimately why I left, because I just didn't have time to sit around and wait. But I did, because of the structure in those days, I did manage to get quite a lot of very useful experience, on casework and policy work and secondments and all of that stuff. So it was a good groundwork.
Brilliant. I mean, I was going to joke about, from theology to the Church of England's investment portfolio, but I ended up with a career all through my 20s, accidentally ended up as an independent financial advisor and then investment broker, and worked in Holborn in the city. And it was great experience, paid off my student debts, helped buy the house that I live in. And but I was regularly surprised and stopped being surprised at the number of people in financial services I met who had a theology degree. Senior auditors, senior fund managers, people that had been training for the priesthood and left. I mean, I stopped being surprised at it was only anecdotal, but it seemed an inordinately large number of people had gone from theology to finance.
Yeah. And similarly, Foreign Office, that's where you also find a lot of closet theologians.
Right. Yeah. And to this day, I still don't know what the correlation is, or why they're able to.
I think this is why. I do every so often try and sort of decide whether I've got the energy for it, but I do feel there needs to be a bit of a campaign about theology degrees, because it is such, a bit like we do in America. It's a sort of classic liberal arts thing where you're doing history, you're doing languages, you're doing philosophy. I mean, it's better than PPE because it's much richer, and it feels like it should be a kind of identikit, classic sort of sheep dip training for anybody who wants to just be a decently educated person. I think it's got confused in the academy, because it's now really about sort of vicar training. Even my brother's college, New College, they don't offer theology anymore because they were getting sort of people who were just trying to sneak into Oxford through the back door and weren't taking it seriously. And they're not up for that, because you either do it properly or you don't bother. So I do feel, I suppose I'm not as, I think there's a massive correlation between musicians and mathematicians. So you get an awful lot of people in finance who've got music degrees as well. But I suppose I would share your confusion in that I think working for the church commissioners, I'd sort of assumed you sort of inherit these biases from, what faculty believe, and liberation theology, and the sort of strand of Marxism that's still writ large in a lot of sort of theological thinking on money and economics. And of course, the church was always traditionally quite posh because it was the third son or something, and livings and patronage and stuff. And of course, posh doesn't do trade. And so there's always been a sort of very anti-industry thing going on in the church, which still unfortunately persists. So I think I'd assumed that everyone in the city was probably of the devil and, going to hell in a handcart. And I found myself, which I have said many times, and I don't mean to be rude, but actually I do mean to be rude. I found myself extremely surprised that there was much better behaviour in the city than I'd ever seen in the church. And I would stand by that now, in that I think there is just so much not misunderstanding across those divides about what people are doing and what they're up to. And I was very taken by an awful lot of the ethos that I saw in business. Some of it, not great. But actually, yeah, I think that repays quite a lot of fault, really, that confusion of God and mammon in that way.
Yeah, we'll get on to your research interests and mine. I must admit, after 10 years of working in the city, had and still have a frustration with cloistered academics who talk about economics and capitalism in such esoteric and disconnected realities, as if you could just reinvent it. It's just like, it drives me mad. But we'll get to that when I get to that part of your research. So you go off, So how do you decide to leave this job and go back to university and study business and an MBA? What happened there?
Well, as I say, there was a lot of dead men's shoes, and it was quite a process to sort of get on. So I sort of wasn't seeing my career in the church commissioners because I just didn't feel there was enough opportunity at pace for me. And my last job there, my last substantial job, I'd been seconded to Church House to help with this thing called the Turnbull Report, which was a big deal because it was part of the sort of post 800 million punish the commissioners routine, and it was about trying to get the church's governance back in kilter. And the Turnbull Report had come out in the aftermath of all of that and recommended this quite sort of managerial board solution, which now is the Archbishop's Council. So I was seconded to be secretariat of the sort of follow-up group to implement all of that. And I remember feeling a bit mortified because, I mean, I had a theology degree, which, you know, I was quite good, you know, I wasn't stupid or anything, but I only had a theology degree. And I was being asked to write, there were all these great and the good, you know, future archbishops and all that stuff sitting around tables and people who were Sir this and whatever that, and pontificating about the way things ought to be. And then you'd get the minutes and it would say the Secretariat will write a report on vision and priority setting in the Church of England, cultural change in the Church of England, all that. And it'd be muggins. And this again was before Google. So you'd be sitting there, you know, desperately trying to figure out how on earth you could write a paper on that kind of thing. So I felt, I remember writing a paper on theology and management, in which I made the immortal recommendation that the church should adopt a missionary position on that subject, which is still famous within the church. There's only one person that smiled at that point. So I did write some stuff, which was probably not awful, but I mean, I had no idea. And I just sort of thought how embarrassing that this organization is not accessing skills and competence, because there must be people who know about mergers. There must be people that know about this stuff. And the church is so arrogant and just thinks, oh, nobody can possibly understand our pain and our world. And I thought, well, bugger this, you know, I never want to be in a position where I am so incompetent again. So I took myself off to do an MBA because I thought that will make me learn. I will have to learn organizations and I will have to learn how you would do these kinds of things. And to be honest, I love the MBA for all kinds of reasons, but it's a bit academic. They basically recycle all the undergraduate teachers and they just do it a bit faster for the grown-ups. So, you know, I learned a lot, but largely by accident, because we sort of took over and we kept teaching each other because, you know, the lecturers weren't really up to it in quite a lot of cases. But I therefore went to Deloitte because I thought I need to learn this really rather than just in books. And if I go and be a consultant, then I'll have to be good, because otherwise they'll sack me. And I'll have to be able to go into organizations and make things right. And so I had a policy of sort of leaping behind cupboards whenever partners arrived to avoid being put on the wrong projects, because somebody I joined with was sent to the MOD for 4 years, you know, and they might as well have just got paid to be there permanently, really. But I managed to game it so that I was only ever on quite short-term projects, and I worked across all the sectors. So I specialized in capital markets and a bit of public sector, but I also did retail, I did high tech, I did, you know, a whole load of things. And so it meant I really learned businesses and learned differences, but also similarities, which has stood me in really good stead. So that was a really rich experience.
Now, can you tell me about the Lucy Clayton Charm Academy? Was this the culmination of a plan from the Jackie article? Sorry, I'm being...
Oh, this is brilliant. This is because one of my sisters is quite reactionary, very feminist, and the posh aunt that I mentioned, the lovely sheriff, had been sent to Lucy Clayton in the 60s by Miss Theobald, the aunt with the tiara. And you know, it's where Joanna Lumley and all that gang went. It was a thing. You did modelling courses. And then they branched out and realised the best way to meet husbands was either to be a nanny or a secretary. So they did sort of courses in that as well. And so my aunt would often volunteer us to go, and had been offering my big sister, who's her goddaughter, you know, ever since she'd sort of been 18 or whatever, and she thought that was absolute nonsense and was never going to be doing quite so frightful. But because I was living in Edinburgh near my aunt when I was doing my MBA, the thing came up in conversation again, because I'd been regaling her with some tales from the class, and she said, I think it's frightful. They're teaching you all this really important stuff about economics, but they're not teaching you about people. And she said, what you need to know is about people. And so she paid for me to spend, in those days, you used to be able to go for a whole year, I think. In those days, it was sort of a short course in the summer. And, it was also a kind of, I think some people used it as a sort of coming out, because they still do coming out. I mean, it's all a bit weird and corrupt these days, but there's still a sort of dinner party circuit and sort of weird stuff going on that probably one doesn't want to know about. So they did sort of cycle through these sort of fine young gals who were sort of being schooled like horses for various manoeuvres. I did a late one in the summer between doing my MBA and joining Deloitte, and it was an Irish girl from a farm who needed a bit of polish. That's why she'd been sent by her godmother. And there was a very shy girl who was about to go off and do nat ski at Durham or something. And then there was a very cool customer who'd been sort of at all the right sort of schools and just thought it sort of, she'd managed to game it so she didn't go pre-season because she didn't really want to do the season. She'd done a deal with her parents so she could at least do the finishing school bit. So there weren't very many of us. And we had these extraordinary tutors. We had some who were really quite old school, and you can exactly imagine. But we had our main person who worked with us was a very impressive lady who'd been a ballerina and did many of the voices on Spitting Image and was a very cool customer. And by then it was all sort of pop psychology. We learned about transactional analysis and Myers-Briggs, and we did learn about hair, nails, makeup, all that. We learned about interview technique. It was all very practical and incredibly useful. But we were in this big room where they had still the fake car that they used to train you to get in and out of without showing your knickers. So we did make her show us that. So I have an approved technique for not showing my knickers. Therefore, we also practiced, girls with class photos, going up and down the stairs, all that stuff, which was actually dead useful. And I was taught to curtsy, which was really quite helpful because, of course, when I became chairman of Gordonstoun, I did have to have a private audience, and I needed to know how to do that kind of thing.
Well, thank you for explaining how that came about. And so you've already touched on working for some years as a change management consultant. I'm assuming that it was a pretty masculine world that you were in. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I loved about Deloitte is it is one of the most truly egalitarian and meritocracies, whatever the word is, meritocracies that I've worked in. In that the business model in those days was pretty straightforward. They'd basically hoover up bright young things with loads of energy and loads of brain power, and then they would ring you out and send you off to go and work for a client afterwards. So a pretty cynical business model, but an incredibly effective one. And I stayed for 4 years, which was longer than many people, and the average was probably about 2.5 years. So it was all brightest and best, and therefore they didn't care who you were. So we had all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds, because as long as you were good and as long as you were billable and you were getting thumbs up from the clients, fantastic. So yes, it was masculine, but there were also some very cool women there because, again, they were fairly gender blind. I mean, not when you get senior. This was when, entry level. Massive problems around seniority. And again, that was a reason that I've never stuck around, because there were no sensible women at partner level in those days. And those that were at partner level were not doing the kinds of things with their lives that I would think would be what I would choose to do. That's changed a lot these days, not enough, but more. But as a sort of career step, it was a brilliant maneuver because I just, you earned enough money. You weren't around to spend it very much because you were always abroad. I think I was in Britain for about 4 months in those 4 years. The rest of the time I was out at client site. And so you were living on expenses, and you can't do it for very long because you have to sacrifice so much. I mean, the job has to come first. So you can't make any commitments. You can't arrange to see anyone. You only have maybe a bit of Saturday to yourself because Sunday's probably doing the laundry and packing your bags and getting on a plane again. So you give up a lot, but you get a lot out of it as long as you're incredibly clear-eyed about what you're up to.
Yeah, a lot of my clients in my 20s were lawyers and accountants, and I and I noticed the track to partnership. And I must admit, to this day, when my son thought about training to be a lawyer, I'm like, I just don't know I ever want my son to become a partner in a legal firm in London, because I saw 20 years ago how you basically seemed to sell your soul to the company. And then the few clients I had through accounting routes in Deloitte and PwC and others, it seemed to be a similar, all-consuming thing to be a partner. In fact, I think you mentioned it in one of your books, don't you? The journeyman versus the partner. Just becomes a complete way of life, doesn't it? And then I go and become a church planter and spend 80 hours a week doing that. So
but I think it is vocational, but in a different way. I mean, I think the thing about being the absolute value they instilled in you at Deloitte was about client service. And so if the client wants you on a Saturday morning or in the middle of the night, you have to be there and you have to be brilliant. I mean, there was all kinds of internal rules about you could drink, but you couldn't get more drunk than the client. There was a whole load of stuff about you always had to remember that you're there for the client and you always need to be available to suddenly produce a spreadsheet and be fabulous at the drop of a hat, and nothing should compromise that. And that gets, my goodness, does that get turned into something pretty wicked. But as a discipline, being attentive to the other is exactly what happens to you if you have any vocational job, which is that you put those other people first, and unless you're really careful, that sort of kenosis becomes an ego trip, and it just becomes so self-emptying that you end up being a husk. And I think that's the case for so many people. It's not just something in the church, but I think it feels particularly costly in the church, particularly at the moment.
Yeah, interesting. So what broadly were the strengths and weaknesses in the business leadership world that you observed? So you're there as a Christian, you got a theology degree, you're looking into this world. Where are you?
I just didn't. There was something really missing for me. I mean, I've talked about this a bit because I started articulating it as something to do with business ethics, something to do with the sort of nascent BSR agenda in those days now, ESG, all that kind of behavior about businesses in the community and ethics and all that. And there was a bit of sort of training, learning, development about trying to be a person of integrity and bringing your whole self and all that was sort of bubbling up. But there was something not landing for me about the whole thing. And I started getting involved through the University of Surrey in something called the International Conference on Organizational Spirituality, because I wondered if it was something to do with workplace spirituality. So I got involved in that quite early on in the late 90s, I think, early noughties. But that wasn't enough either, because there was quite a lot of lipstick on pig there, and you'll know yourself because you've met these people. There's quite a lot of sort of getting your head down and earning all you can, and it's all the ends justifies the means, and then you look up and think, crikey, what have I become? And then you do lots of expiation and legacy. But actually there ought to be a better way. So I was trying to figure out what was missing in terms of the sort of moral compass, the heart of it, the point of it, the whole kind of axiom of what we were up to, which is what took me into the journey to do the doctorate, because I realized that you could have all kinds of people pretending to behave really well, and a whole load of other stuff around us reprioritizing triple bottom lines and quadruple bottom lines and stuff. But if actually there was something broken about the whole system, then we could never address that unless we address the systemic problems. And it felt precarious to me. Rightly so, as it turned out, with the crash and everything else. And it felt like we were running out of time. So because I had a bit of a notion about this being something to do with the structures of capitalism, I had a bit of a think about how on earth you'd go about getting into that, particularly if you're me and you haven't done economics or anything sensible. And I thought, well, actually, when Adam Smith and all these people were trotting around writing the rules, not exclusively Adam Smith, but he was in that world. They assumed God, they assumed a Judeo-Christian context. There was a whole load of worldview stuff going on that we don't assume anymore. And I wondered if we could use the fact that I was a theologian and worked in the Church of England to get back into that mindset, to try and spot what was baked in at that stage, which is not quite right, or was making assumptions that we can't safely make anymore. And that's what took me off into the doctoral studies, really.
And that's why you took a theological route rather than a leadership, because you could have easily lent into leadership PhDs, couldn't you?
Yeah, because it felt to me like it was something about rules, and it was very fundamental. And I'd read enough about a worry that the system was free riding on a morality. It wasn't replenishing, and there was kind of no way, because of the structure of it, to sort of shore that up. So there was a parasitic tendency that was potentially going to kill the whole system over time. And of course, if you're Adam Smith and writing in a milieu where you can assume some basic rules in society around what good behavior looks like and what good professions look like and respect, and you can make some assumptions fairly safely, which you cannot make in a globally diverse community as we have today, with a very different structure in terms of upbringing, schooling, and formation. And I think you do get a better lens you could look at that philosophically, but I think because even Adam Smith's language about invisible hand is very freighted with ideas about God and fate and all kinds of other stuff. So it felt to me that I had the perfect tools actually to look at it in a way that very few people could, because you get very blindsided by all the economics if that's the only way you go into it, and you start from a different place.
Yeah. I mean, I did a professional doctorate, Doctor of Ministry, and then then moved on to a PhD in theology, and I looked at basically evangelicals and capitalism. And I must admit, in scouring around on the scant literature early on, of course, come across your work. And in fact, your work made its way into my methodological section to justify how I was going to talk about capitalism, rather than the technical aspects, the relational and social. And then I used a mixture of social science and Anglo-Catholic theological reflections, because there aren't any evangelical theologies of capitalism, and then had to apply it. So yeah, your work was influential methodologically. So it's another reason I was looking forward to hearing you today. And I'll get to some questions when we get to the end on that, if I may, not just for myself, but it's germane to your research and your ongoing projects. Now, where will I go with my questions here? Yeah, we'll go here. Also found it fascinating, and I think we haven't had this conversation, and I would like to continue one, if I may, with you after today. I'm finding myself in a post-PhD environment, having turned 50, with an interest in neurotheology, and it's been interesting reading your recent books, looking at what you're leaning into in terms of leadership development in particular, and behavioural aspects, and I guess cognitive science, behavioural science, and all those kinds of things. So my question would be this to you: in one of your talks, and it's in the Leadersmithing, I'm sure, or it's a summary on your website somewhere. I'll ask you about method in a moment, but you do this role-playing thing, and you talk about picking. You realize I'm not very good at conflict, and I'm not very good at conflict with men in particular. So I'm going to pick some fights with the chaps, role play this. Maybe we'll get back to the method that led to that as an experiment. But could you tell us a bit more about that?
So because of this fabulous godfather who had been brought up by the Annas in Darjeeling and was confused, he had discovered the Daniel Goleman book on emotional intelligence in his 50s, I guess, and phoned me up weeping one night saying, "Why didn't they tell me?" So I read the book with him, and we talked about it a lot. And so I sort of had some early conditioning in his thinking about amygdala hijacks in particular, and sort of emerging ideas about the structure of the brain, which of course now neuroscience can tell us an awful lot more about. So when I got to Ashridge, I started noticing, so one of my clients was the MOD, and we would always get all their profiles because they all did Myers-Briggs and things. And there was one particular group, 28 people, where there was 26 introverts, mainly engineers by background, and 2 extroverts. And you could tell who they were because they're all sat there going, facial cues, whereas all the introverts were like, you thought you were dying. They were like, give me some feedback. The thing I noticed about the MOD is if you were in the military, you'd had to learn really good relating skills because you just have to have those in order to command people. Whereas if you were the sort of civvy types in the MOD and you just come up through the sort of engineering route or whatever, you didn't necessarily breathe those things in. So I very controversially started teaching emotional intelligence to the MOD many years ago before it became a trendy thing. So I spoke to them quite a lot about this sort of basic neuroscience, and in trying to articulate it in this idea of amygdala hijacks, I realised that I'd had one that I could articulate and remember, which led to the sort of picking fights with chaps thing, which was about an experience I'd had at Deloitte where I had been a very arrogant management consultant, and I'd been sort of trotting around Mayfair being fabulous, and the client had discovered an error in an email and tried to phone a variety of people to make a fuss and hadn't been able to get through to them, and finally got through to me, and she ranted down the phone and shouting and swearing, and I had this very visceral reaction where all I wanted to do was go to the loo. So I remember just sort of handing the phone to a partner and legging it off down the corridor. And because I was, trying to be a fabulous career woman at the time, I spent quite a lot of time after that trying to figure out how do I not do that again, because it's kind of a career limiting maneuver. And with the benefit of thinking about Goldman and amygdala hijacks, I realized that had been a very classic sort of templated response when my body had been trying to rescue me, but had possibly deployed the wrong template. And the being a nicely brought up girl from Fife thing was because, of course, in those days, you weren't encouraged to take blokes on, be particularly lippy. There was quite a lot of knowing your place in that very 1970s way. And the only template I had, therefore, was being shouted at by my dad in the garden when I was 3. I'd been avoiding conflict my entire life because it wasn't seemly. And I realized that, in business, you do need to be able to, very respectfully, but call things out, challenge things, provide data that you've got that may not agree with the data in the room. Otherwise, you just get groupthink and nonsense. And so as part of my development, I decided on this picking fights with chaps strategy to try and build up more templates. And to begin with, it was all stuff like, writing passively aggressively in meetings or going, non-verbals. And then eventually it was things like, could you repeat that? And then, I'm not sure I trust your data, sir. Could you say more? And just trying to sort of raise my game until I'd sort of inoculated myself so that I wouldn't get that sort of flooding when I was shouted at. And that actually became pivotal to the whole leadersmithing genre, really, that I then developed, which was trying to figure out what more of those things do we need to give leaders so that they become fearless in a better and bigger range of leadership situations. Because what I was noticing was that because of very traditional education patterns and experience and exposure, very few leaders had that kind of emotional resilience and ability to be their best selves in such a big range of conversations. And frankly, you're no good to an organization as a leader if you're not good under fire. And we weren't hiring for that, and we weren't teaching it.
Yeah. So having only got your book the other day, Leadersmithing, in preparation for today, my crude understanding of it, I'll present to you, and then you can correct me and nuance it better for me. So it's, if you ask experienced leaders what they would tell a younger version of them that they would need to know, and you come up with these 17 practices, and straight away that gets my attention theologically, because I'm convinced, habits and practices are what actually form us and shape us to receive things. And then if you could stick people with heart monitors and brain waves and measure their neurochemical, biological, physiological responses to things, and they could practice some of these things, it'd be like, you say template, but also I think maybe the word app is in the book, but you could then bring those, and the premise behind this, that leaders are made, not born. So instead of spending a long time thinking something in your head that you then have to reach for in the real world, just throw you in the deep end, give you some as close to real world experiences so that in the moment you can fire that up in those leadership moments that you need. You don't need 10,000 hours, as you mentioned in your book, but you can have these templates to do. Have I broadly understood?
That's absolutely spot on. Yeah.
Great. I mean, as I say, if we talk theologically for a minute, so my PhD landed me at the point of, very because it were Anglo-Catholic sources, and it's habits, desire, what we love is what we do, and what we do shapes what we love, and I get all of that, and curriculums and learning, but underneath it all is this, I've got a deep fascination with how does desire work? How does attention work? How do habits work? So I've had this sort of sideline of reading books and materials, and I'm sort of getting to a point in my own neurotheology thinking, how can we make psychological and behavioral readings of worship practices for Christian formation and identity, and also a favorite book of mine that my Doctor of Ministry students love is Edwin Friedman, Failure of Nerve. And of course, as you know, that's predicated on being differentiated from anxiety. But again, it begs the question, because it's not one he answers, how does anxiety in your body work? And how can you recognize it and be ready to respond to it differently? So, yeah. So
if we talk about Samson in the temple, pushing those pillars down, there's a whole set of stories about hysterical strength. You read in the Daily Mail about some granny picking a tractor off a baby. We know there are a lot of stories of people doing something frankly extraordinary. And when you look into the permission your brain has entered into to make that happen, even if we don't quite understand why, it seems to be this very particular transition between fight and flight. So it seems that rather than that being a sort of binary choice, you either go right or left, it seems to be a progression, so that when you are under threat, if there's any anxiety or challenge or anything out there, of course, in order to survive, your body preps itself to be able to fight this. And in that moment, we'll make a decision about, is it fight or flight? Because we know from all the brain scanning and stuff that in that moment, when the adrenaline and cortisol starts being produced and your heart starts going faster and all that, you get more of your brain is in use. And it's a bit like trying to find your car keys and you're sort of rushing around the house. Your brain goes bananas trying to be resourceful to find you something that will stop you from dying. And I guess when you start looking at it like that, you start noticing that it isn't a scientific decision, am I resourced to cope? It is entirely a call that is made somewhere in your body. I am resourced to cope. I am going to push these pillars down. I am going to rescue this child from under a tractor. It just happens because you've decided that you can do it. So I got really interested about that threshold. What if we could imagine we could do more? And how would we convince ourselves that we could? Because what's really interesting about the brain is that you can fool the brain because it's so resourceful under pressure. It will use anything it's got, a dream, a vision, a practice, as well as a reality. So the reason that Olympic athletes spend all that time visualizing is it becomes tracks in the brain that they can use as well as the actual experiences. So all the simulations with actors that I use and I talk about is because that's as good as a real template, because your body will tend to react chemically in a very similar way than it would in a real place. So for me, so much of it is about trying to, it's very difficult because no matter how deep your faith and no matter how sure you are that you are defended and that God will prevail, we are very frail people, and your brain just gets very overpowered, really. And so trying to figure out, in the army, they've had to get expert at this because lives are absolutely on the line every day. So they do incredibly diligent and precise training to lay down these tracks, because they know that if all the standard operating procedures become coded as heuristics, you're not using any brain energy on that. It just becomes like picking up your mug or putting some sugar in your tea or something totally habitual. And I mean, the monastic orders have always known this about formation and daily practices and things. And the church is only really catching up because, we put people through vicar school and then we kind of shove them in a parish and hope for the best in the past. There wasn't really any sense of paying attention apart from the odd sabbatical and retreat. But I think we're getting clearer, particularly around the plasticity of the brain, this is hard work and it's very precise work. And it is about, for whichever world you're in, being clear about what do you need to be good at, what do you need to be absolutely fearless about, and in that realm, what are you avoiding like the plague, and therefore what do you need to design in now so that you will never be knocked off course because you're terrified.
Yeah, I've been fascinated by correlations of this in general with competency cycles. So, the whole unconscious and then conscious incompetence. And noting for discipleship, I'm thinking of discipleship and leadership, that when people get to the place of knowing what they don't know and all those things that kick in, anxiety, insecurity, imposter syndrome, is all those places they stop. And I've noticed that spiritual direction, coaching, mentoring all help people through that place where they have to act out things that are intensely uncomfortable for them, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, neurochemically, until it then becomes part of who they are. I mean, that seems like that's what your leadership practices are at that threshold, aren't they, for growth and development?
It's very much building on Aristotle, building on Alistair McIntyre. It's really obvious. I haven't cast either Leadersmithing or Toxic Assumptions as Christian books, because then that tends to immediately limit the readership. But anyone who looks at the bibliography or knows anything will very much see the footprints and the intellectual influences. And the thing is, if you're going to take virtue ethics seriously, you need to understand how that is created. It's not just a class you do at school. It is about practices, and it's about being very deliberate about that. And we've got loads of traditions within religion as well as other places on how you pull that off. And I think within leadership, because it had been hijacked as a sort of MBA style thing rather than a apprentice thing, it was like you pass the exam and that's it, brilliant, chief exec, thumbs up. And for me, it was trying to reconnect with that sort of daily grind of just trying to become a better person every day. And what are the disciplines that are required in that? And in leadership, it's very, very precise, because you can zoom into the future and ask your future self to give your past self advice, because we started doing that research in 2003 and it didn't materially shift. So even though stricting up your robot secretary for inappropriate physical contact with your physical other secretary, we don't know exactly what the protocol is for that, but we know you're probably going to feel confused, uncomfortable, not sure your boundaries or the law or ethics or whatever. And that is stuff that we can teach you now and you can learn now. And then that means that all that stuff is habitual and you've got all the spare capacity for all the novelty.
Yeah. This would turn into a complete interview on its own, and maybe I'll do that another day with you if you allow me. But the last sort of technical, academic-ish practice question as well. So you talk about the army. Now, there's all the world of difference between being templated to avoid, being hijacked by your hormones so that you can, efficiently kill people. And the virtue ethics of being a good and better person. I'm thinking out loud here to the question, have you found in your research, I don't mean in terms of conceptualizing, I mean in terms of people in the real world, that when they engage in habits and practices formed around virtue, that it does something differently to them biologically and biochemically? So I'll give you an example. So my brother he was a bouncer when he was 19, 20. He spent much of his 20s as an alcoholic. He had every hormonal hijacking burnt out of him. He could literally face anyone and anything and not have any stress response at all, because he was so primed for violent behavior and it wouldn't bother him at all. I mean, that's bad conditioning. But then I've watched him become a Christian and become wired differently by habits and practices around virtue. He's now a man who feels things he couldn't feel before, and cries when he couldn't cry before, and feels shame when he didn't feel shame before. Does that question make sense? I'm asking you, have you noticed a correlation between practice and virtue? It's not that being virtuous is a nicer thing. It's actually, this is the way human beings were made to be.
Well, a couple of things, and they may not quite answer the question in the same way that I think you're seeking. But I experienced two very different people at Ashridge, one of whom had no reaction to any of this stuff because they had been in a really bad climbing accident. They'd been in a coma for about 8 months. And when they came out of that, they were actually fairly ego-free and very grateful to be alive, and therefore weren't triggered by so many of those other things that we are. On the other hand, another person who didn't react had been in a highly abusive family where she'd been constantly trying to protect her mother, and she herself had been abused rather badly. And so she would just go into that very, very cool eye of the storm place when anything happened, because that, again, the bad conditioning you talk about. So I think there are very different ways that the brain gets affected because the brain is plastic. So I would absolutely agree with you that you can train the brain any way you like. You can turn people into nasty killers by just switching off bits of their brains if that's what you want to do. So you need to be dead careful about this stuff by intent. So I would absolutely agree that those people, it's again, Aristotle, you do good, you become good by doing good, and you become honorable by behaving honorably. And, there's that whole thing that neuroscientists would absolutely say is that you do retrain the brain by occupying different behaviors. And I guess if we're going to go back to Jackie, the kind of be and become, it is that I think with cognitive behavioral therapy and all the enthusiasms about our brains and artificial intelligence, and there's a huge sort of fascination with the brain coming first and the thought coming first. But actually we know that often the behavior is more effective because then the brain will catch up and make sense of it really quickly. So even if your brain doesn't want you to, even if you practice that conversation, everything your brain is saying, run away, hideous, hideous. If your body's learned it, then it says to your brain, look, we didn't die, that's okay. And then your brain will kind of do the math. So I think it raises a massive question, which is one of the reasons I'm interested in Gordonstoun, about how do we do this whole, if we're very clear now about brain training in a very specific way through neuroscience, how do we stop that being hijacked by dark forces of whatever sort? And how do we learn that well so that we're making sure that that is brought in appropriately to education?
Yeah. Because it sounds like it's not so much, I mean, you use the phrase brain training, but it's mind, body. I mean, it's all of
training
it.
in a
We're
way.
embodied
Yeah.
in existence, aren't we? That's where we live, even our minds. Maybe this is a slight step backwards. I want to squeeze all my questions in with you, if I may. Now, you've talked about in your writing some outstanding mentors or managers. So Martin Ellengorn, Anne O'Brien, Phil Hodgson, Mark Pegg. Can you tell us why they stood out for you?
So Martin Ellengorn was my first boss at the Church Commissioners, and I'm still very much in touch with him today. And he stood out because I was a very new young person. I was finding my way. I was hitting a lot of resistance. I think when you're young and you're keen, you don't know the rules, and you don't know you ought to look a bit more stupid than you are, and, not upset people by outpacing them too quickly. All that stuff, young bucks get knocked out of them. And it was being knocked out of me quite vehemently by a particular boss. And that was quite tricky because there was quite a lot of collusion keeping that happening. And big questions, I guess, for the whole organization about why these things weren't sorted out earlier and more systemically. But Martin obviously could see what was going on and found ways to sort of reach down and encourage me by doing little projects around policy or sort of appreciating interventions I made and making sure that I knew that he thought I was good. So on all the days where I just wanted to throw in the towel and I was feeling miserable and all of that, it was a sort of lodestar. And it was a very generous and diffident mentoring. It wasn't, avuncular or weird or kind of directioned in any way. It was just a very quiet support and recognition, which really helped keep me steady at a really pivotal time. And that was very similar to Phil Hodgson at Ashridge, because Ashridge was another place where they didn't really welcome people coming in and trashing the place. And, I had a lot of big ideas and I was in a hurry. What a disaster doing a program where everyone's going to feel sick all the time because they're not going to give you happy sheets, are they? So, putting people through 2 days from hell, albeit based on some really clever thinking, isn't going to get you gold stars. And it's actually really hard and costly work. So who wants to be staffed on that bloody program pool? So I wasn't popular, and it was a massive labour of love. They tried to cancel the whole thing several times. And again, Phil Hodgson was one of our sort of resident gurus. He'd done a lot of pioneering work on leadership and uncertainty with some mates from America, quite early doors. But again, a bit like Martin, he reached through and made sure I knew that he was keeping an eye. And occasionally there'd be a bit of air cover if there was, plots to try and suppress me again. And so both of them had a very similar sort of effect and a very similar style, which is very quiet, steady, believing in me, which helped keep me going. And then again, I would draw parallels with Anne and Mark. So Anne was one of the only senior people at Deloitte that I rated. She did end up being a partner in Deloitte and would still to this day be one of the only people that I could see as a role model in that environment, with huge integrity, but also incredibly professionally impressive. And very cited on gender. So there was gender going on, of course, there always is in these places. And again, she sought me out. She'd rather accidentally staff me on a project fairly early doors, and I'd done enough on that for her to keep an eye out. And so she staffed me on some quite crucial programs and projects. And I learned a lot from her personally, and also the other people that she drew into the teams around me. And again, I kept in touch with her. She is much more like me than the two gentlemen who were much more introverted and diffident, and she's a sort of doer and a fixer, and I think could recognize some of that in me, but also had learned the hard way how to calibrate that a bit, and that's proved very helpful. And so Mark Pegg, he was the person that hired me into Ashridge. Again, I was young and female, teaching leadership, not cool, because everyone I was teaching were blokes at least 20 years older than me, so it was a big risk. And he was absolutely adamant that he recognised me. He believed in me, and he did a lot of very active supporting when they were trying to shut me up and shut me down. And is the reason that Leadersmithing came to be, really, because he and Phil between them created the space for that experiment to happen. And of course now Ashridge runs about 10 of them a week, and it's their biggest money spinner, because it is a very robust process and it really works.
Yeah.
It was a risk.
Well, yeah. Well, thank you. That last bit answers the next question I was going to ask. So of how you got there and some of the ups and downs. I was just thinking out loud here with you talking about mentors and key people. You realize how they become templates for us, don't they? We're in those moments when we're thinking, I don't know. Your brain reaches for, what should I do? What would that wonderful person I know say or be in this moment? So I can, mimic their words and their disposition.
I think it is a bit like standing on a boat and checking the North Star. I mean, you often do know where you're going, and you've got maps and you've got the right crew and all that, but occasionally you just kind of want to know. So those four individuals I'm still very much in touch with for those moments when I'm worrying about believing myself for a minute, and I know that they'll know. And those sort of lifelong relationships that I think many of us develop with mentors are just really important to just keep you on course when you're slightly losing heart. And I'm so grateful to them for that, because they're still sticking in there helping with that.
Absolutely. Can we talk a little bit more about courage, how it can be developed in leaders? You quoted from St. Paul about endurance.
Yes.
I actually preached from this on Sunday. We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering, I like the
very Scottish.
Yeah. We glory, the Greek there is to glory in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us. So talking about courage, and you seem to imply that leaders can steel themselves against fear by using their brain more effectively in the modes that we've talked about here. But yes, courage. What does courage mean for you?
So this is my Princess Diaries moment.
Princess Diaries.
Princess Diaries. So have you watched the Princess Diaries?
I have. I will admit to absolutely loving it.
Excellent. So you will recall the moment where she's supposed to be turning up for that speech and saying that she'll be the crown princess and all that stuff, and she's bottling it and hiding. And her now dead father has taken precautions for this eventuality and has written her a letter of instruction before he was tragically killed in that car accident. And the letter says, there are some things that are more important than fear. And I just think that's it. That's it. Disney wisdom. And I think you see that all over the Gospels. Fear just is not relevant. Fear is important feedback. It's a bit like, I often talk about Olympic training and pain. You speak to a rower or whatever, and pain is fascinating. It's like data. It shows you've reached a threshold and you just have to get through that threshold. And I mean, we think, oh, bloody hell, you're weird. But actually, it's trying to understand what your body's up to. So an awful lot of these templates, a lot of these messages are because your body is trying to do what it's supposed to do, which is keep you safe, keep you. So of course, fear is really important because it is trying to stop you being eaten by wolves or killed in battle or whatever. But it's just information, and it may be information that is relevant or not. And if it's your child, you would not think that information was relevant. If a dragon was trying to eat your baby, you wouldn't give a toss about the dragon. You'd be grabbing the baby as quick as you could, even if they took your leg off. So, we know this. It's normal. But we forget it in business type situations because we're just in a different category of behaving. And for me, it's just trying to get real about the basics here, which is that you need to, it's that sort of trashy, feel the fear, do it anyway thing, but it is being incredibly aware of what your body is telling you and then sorting the data and prioritizing it. So for me, courage is about noticing that your body is telling you to run very fast in the opposite direction, trying to be curious about why, and then trying to trump that card with something more important, which is why I think character trumps confidence. Because even if you're not confident, you'll still have your character. And if you have done all the stuff you talk about formation and virtue, you will be brave enough, you will have the right values, you will be able to prevail because you've done the work. And of course, the people that bottle it, the people that buckle, are people who haven't had that work done on them either. So you see a lot of these people in senior positions who've been to the wrong boarding schools and they've got no resources. They don't know how to cope when tribulation hits because they've never had anything go against them ever. I mean, Tony Little, when he left Eton, said this about gilded youths. He said, they've never failed. They've never had anyone say no. How are they going to cope? Whereas places like Gordonstoun, they train that into you, from when you're wee. They make you stand up and play your fiddle in front of other people, get out in a boat and feel sick, not because they're trying to be evil, but because they're trying to help make you brave for the future.
Yeah, I would say I was preaching from that passage on Sunday, and I say I do like to bring a bit of neurotheology into my preaching, and I forget the name of the psychologist who studied 600 children who'd been severely traumatized, and actually as a result of their trauma, as awful it was, they developed resilience and emotional intelligence. And then the whole danger of basically, I was using it for discipleship. We live in a world where we try to protect our children, and we think that avoiding suffering, I mean, here's the passage we looked at, is good for us, and it's not. It's the opposite. We are, even epigenetically, there are things in us when we take responsibility and follow through on commitments and have sufferings for a noble purpose, we come alive.
Yeah.
And if you've never had that, then if you wait till you're in your 30s or 40s when your marriage blows up or you get made redundant, you've got no ability to, you haven't got.
This is why it's absolutely crackers for boards not to take diversity seriously, because actually people who have come from diverse backgrounds have had to fight so hard. They've got all the templates you need to be a brilliant leader. So actually all these sort of Oxbridge types who are excellent at debating, you don't know if they're going to buckle or not because they've never had that struggle. So I think there was so much to be said about, I don't think anyone wishes hardship on anyone, and it's not about trying to give people a dreadful time. And I'm quite glib about the simulation is inviting people to Ashridge to treat them, horribly for a couple of days to learn them. And so you do need to be really careful about how you hold this and what you're up to, which is why getting involved in Gordonstoun is fascinating, because you have to treat children incredibly gently in terms of what your intent is and what you are doing with them. But if you can create safe spaces for people to try, for them to fail, for them to see other people trying and failing, for them to get up and try again, for it to be okay to try, all those things, if you can do that beautifully, then you do start designing that into kids in a way that, kids from a lot of backgrounds will pick that up anyway, because they're from communities where that will just happen to you. But often it's not happening to you in a very healthy way. Whereas we could get better at that in schools, I think.
I've been reading Stephen Hayes and his work on ACT therapy, but using it in a leadership environment. So my background is I was very severely abused by both my parents when I was younger, and suffered from anxiety greatly, but it was a survival mechanism. I needed to be anxious to be primed to rescue codependent parent, all that kind of stuff, but found it hard to switch that off and had a full nervous breakdown later on in life. Not technically the term, but so I've been on a journey myself with anxiety, but through CBT, but then discovering with ACT therapy the last few years and the health that I found, thinking that the practices of in some pretty intense moments that I find myself institutionally at my age in sometimes with difficult situations and resources and people, that ability to go, what am I feeling, and to live with it, to run away from, those practices for my own mental health, actually I'm finding helpful for leadership, to be differentiated and go, oh, there's that story I tell myself of being a complete idiot and not knowing anything. Hello, story. You can sit over there. You know what I mean? It's
thanks for playing.
It's that world, isn't it? It's very exciting. As I say, I wish I'd read your book sooner, because I see how you have not just theorized this, but you've been.
But we've all got it. I mean, you've got to have a particularly traumatic background, but we've all got experiences and voices and values. And it was a really interesting thing I learned about conflict, is trying to just see through the kind of stress responses you have to it and try and understand what people are fighting to protect. And when I'm anxious and when I'm paranoid and when I get in a right tiz about things, I have to just keep trying to figure out what value has been trampled on. Is that value relevant? Should I be fighting for that value in this context? Is it really important that this is absolutely perfect? Like perfectionism again. It's all coming from a good place. As you say, your anxiety was coming from a really good place. It's just, it may not have been always the best response now that you know what you know. And I think for me, in my own personal journey, as well as Leadersmithing, is just trying to get really realistic about all the data you've got, a lot of which is coming very loudly from your body. But because we've had years of conditioning about, oh, grow up, be rational, all that stuff, particularly if you're a chap, we're not supposed to hear that. We're not supposed to think it's relevant when, you get a funny feeling before you pick up the phone, or you go into a meeting and it feels a bit odd. That is data. That is ancient data trying to get through to us. And so I'm really fascinated in how we can just, without getting narcissistic about it, but just be a bit more thorough about all the templates, all the experiences, all the messages, all the voices, and be able to Google very quickly and prioritize.
Yeah, I must admit, I'm a Parker Palmer fan for spiritual formation, but his practice of wondering has really helped me in moments when I'm triggered. When someone says something that, just because I value data information and I'm easily triggered by what seems like stupidity with people, but now I can hit the pause button and go, I have a secondary conversation, observe myself. I wonder why you would say something so stupid out loud. I can forestall the conversation.
I'm curious about that.
In my head, I can have a conversation instead of the words that come out your mouth, and then you of course, if you're triggered, you come across just as stupid as the person you.
Reflecting on recently is that it is really helpful practice, but it can also be monumentally unhelpful. In that, I think one of the things that it's a discipline for me to be a leader, because if I'm going to write about leadership, I have to be one, and I have to try and be the best one I can be. But the problem about having all these tools and tricks and techniques and understanding is that I know way too much about everyone else. And I can see it, and I can see what they're up to. I can see where they're coming from. Probably I don't always attend as well as I could and as deeply as I could, but I've got a much better take on what people are up to than many other people would, just because I've had 15 years in the classroom on this front. We did an interview, and there was a person who, it was a mixed panel, and there was a bishop, there was me, there was an assets person, and then there was a person of colour who's one of our trustees. And because I have spent hours and hours in the classroom giving people feedback on infinitesimal poker tells around stuff, I wrote some very detailed notes about how this person changed, both in terms of the words they used, the tone they used, their facial expressions, their eye contact, or a whole load of stuff, because they literally changed register with each of these people. And with the person of colour, they were obviously trying to manage their behaviour really well because they knew this was part of the test. But they just couldn't. They were kind of like, there was so much sort of brain work going on. They couldn't kind of hear the question. They couldn't answer the question. There was like this massive problem going on in this particular interaction, as well as the slightly loopy things going on in the other interactions, by the way, that no one else had even noticed. And I mean, great superpower. Sometimes I think it is just desperate, because it makes me probably less good as a leader, because I get very stymied by that. I can see the pain, I can see the posturing, I can see all that stuff, and I don't want to be cruel, but an awful lot of other people would just call it out, wouldn't they?
So like the psychologists and psychiatrists that come home and their spouse says, "Stop analysing me." You can't switch that level off, can you? Well, if it's a cheeky question, now we've got to know each other a bit in the interview. What for you personally, in your own leadership journey and understanding yourself as a leader, what are you wrestling with at the minute? Where would you like to be a better leader? Again, if that question makes sense.
One of the things I'm reflecting on is that leadership is incredibly situational, and there's something about the prophets. It was not always possible to be a prophet in a particular place, and I think I need to get better at fitting my leadership to the situation. So again, being very honest, I feel like I have been the right leader for Gordonstoun. I came in at a particular time in Gordonstoun's history, and I've been able to add quite a lot of value. And it's been a very gracious environment, a very hard environment, but very supportive in terms of trustees and senior staff and all of that. And it feels like it's been really hard work, but really the right work. Whereas, as you'll know, working for the Church of England is a very complex kind of thing to do, particularly when you're in a senior leadership position with lots of other senior leaders. And I'm finding it very hard to do good work here. And so I'm the one thing I'm learning about my leadership is that I need to decide where it's needed, not where I want to go and where I quite fancy adding value, but where actually they want me, and therefore I can be deployed well, rather than everything being a massive fight. And I think, I talked about this in a podcast I did during COVID. There is a gendered aspect to this, which is that there's still quite a lot of environments that aren't used to senior women. And so I think one of the things that's been particularly difficult in the church is that at Gordonstoun it's very clear, I'm the chairman. So if I make a decision, then I'm the chairman. So that's the decision. To begin with, that was a wee bit tricky because it was a male senior executive team, but they kind of got used to that. There was a bit of slightly odd thing that goes on with the gender thing, that if you're a guy and you're senior, then even if your decision may not be something people agree with, they kind of have to go with it. And it's kind of your right, because you're senior, that you're making that call. So if you're a woman and you countermand someone else or you disagree with them, then clearly you're wrong. And so there's a provisionality, which I find really difficult, because the one thing I have learned about leadership is that the only way it works in a very mathematical, arithmetical way is that you churn out decisions to keep the organization moving. And the second those decisions get delayed or held up or second guessed or whatever, the whole thing just grinds into the mud. And so I know that one of the reasons I can't be as effective as I can be in the Church of England at the moment is that my decisions are not final. And that's partly for lots of good reasons, to do with structures and lots of other people involved and, very particular governance regimes. But it's also a wee bit about gender, that quite often I have made proper decisions, but they've essentially been called in as though they were provisional. And I don't think that would happen if I wasn't a woman. So there's a thing I'm wrestling with there, to try and relax about that, but also try and understand how we get better at that.
Yeah, thank you. I just wondered, it's, in my own leadership journey, you realize institutional limitations, political limitations, limitations of yourself. You try and exceed those where you want to, but work within them without thinking that you've capitulated to giving in. And you
need permission. And I think there are some things where I have permission, places I've got permission and places I don't. And women in the church still, on very many levels, don't have permission.
They don't. Strange. My church background is very egalitarian, and we have lots of women leaders. I'm used to strong women leaders, and I'm always stumble over when I meet someone who finds that difficult, and realise how unusual that is, especially in the church world. Never mind the business world.
You are getting better at it. It's just a very slow process, I think.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It is, isn't it? Now, recently we interviewed Sam Wells, and in talking about leadership, he quoted Wellington as saying that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, which brings me back to Gordonstoun. So you mentioned it several times. You chair the board there, and it was founded by the educationalist Kurt Hahn, pronounced that correctly. And you've already touched on that. I was going to ask you about how the school builds character. So let me ask you this question: how did you end up there? What was the relationship that resulted in you in this wonderful?
Well, playing fields of Eton, I was having breakfast with an old Etonian in the Athenaeum. He was trying to access my address book.
Is this where I say, "Oh, fabulous"?
Marvelous.
It's gone downhill recently. Yeah, no.
And he was on the board of Gordonstoun and chairing the process to find a new chairman, and he was trying to pick my brains about candidates. And we had this lovely breakfast, and he told me all about Kurt Hahn and all that stuff. And I was very taken by the whole thing. And I said, well, tell me what you want in a chair and what you need. So he gave me the blurb, and I said, well, I think you need J.K. Rowling because, Hogwarts, woman, rich, fabulous, you'd have people queuing out the door, overnight, be sorted. So I remember he took out his small block pen and wrote J.K. Rowling on a copy of his Times and, pushed off. And then I had this rather odd, truculent call from the headhunter to say, we've been told that we speak to J.K. Rowling, we're really not sure. And so I made some suggestions about how they might approach her and what they might say. And I said she might say no, but she might be quite tickled by the concept of chairing Gordonstoun, And we did used to have a train that dutifully left King's Cross and came all the way up to the school train. Anyway, they didn't choose to pursue that, and instead decided to pursue me. And I was a bit flummoxed because state school girl, blah. It turns out my godfather had been to Gordonstoun, but I didn't really know about Gordonstoun. But when I sort of assumed they just needed a woman for the shortlist, really, and I thought, well, I have a sort of yes mentality as a woman that if I'm asked to do something, I feel like the suffragettes mustn't have died in vain, and we must all keep pushing on. So I was more than happy to play if it would help, them with their thinking. And then the more I got to learn about Gordonstoun, I thought this is what I've been looking for, because as you say, these blokes in their 40s and 50s who turn up at Astridge and falling apart, if they'd gone to a school that took character seriously, we wouldn't have these organisations being so under-led. So I got very curious about what could we learn from Gordonstoun that we could teach back to the rest of the world, because it's all very well to clobber these schools about charitable status and say, make your playing fields available. That's not really the point. It's actually about what do you learn through the processes that you are resourced to apply to education that could be shared elsewhere. So there was then trial by Chablis. I met about 1 million people, lords and ladies and princesses and stuff, and eventually was invited to be chair. And
was that the moment when you were thinking every template from finishing school is
deployed? Although I must tell you about my curtsy injury.
An injury? I've never heard of anyone having a curtsy injury.
Yeah, you have to do an entry curtsy and an exit curtsy. And I was fine on the entry curtsy, but I had quite unfeasibly high-heeled shoes because I was trying to impress. And on my exit curtsy, I twisted my knee. And I had to be helped down the stairs. So that wasn't my finest hour. But I have a curtsy injury, so that's a rare thing to be able to.
A rare thing. It must be quite common for some doctors to attend to in certain circles.
Knee twist, yeah, it's that old handshake curtsy maneuver. I've seen that before. But yeah, so one of the first things I did at Gordonstoun was try and get them to take that seriously. Given what I knew about templating neuroscience from my leadersmithing research, I knew what they were doing. So I'd already met a load of former pupils who told me about, I'm on the chair, I'm on the board of Shell, and I've never been scared of shareholders because, I used to be out in that boat puking my guts up and I thought I was going to die. And so I'm never going to be as scared as I was there, all that stuff. So I knew what Gordonstoun was doing, but I wasn't sure that they really knew, apart from anecdote. So we commissioned this fabulous project, the University of Edinburgh, where they spoke to current pupils, current staff, current parents, and also former pupils right back, 30s and 40s, those who are still alive, about what did you learn, what do you remember, what did you use, what do you think now, to try and get more data on what does character look like, because everyone claims to do character. They bung you out in a field and shove Duke of Edinburgh award on the top of it, but that's not really the point. If you look at Aristotle and the virtues and you look at formation, it must take more weathering than that, than just a one-off trip when you're 18. And so we did establish there's some quite specific things, which is very early on, you have to, in front of your peers, which I know from Leadersmithing is very important, because it's the witnessing that tends to get the heart rate up. If you're doing it privately, there are some emotions that will be triggered, but it's when you're being observed that all that imposter syndrome and shame and all those other emotions come up. So you're with peers, you're having to expose yourself by taking a risk, whether it's, because everything at Gordonstoun, and this is why poor old Prince Charles didn't like it, everything is compulsory. You can't just say, I'm off to do my cello and do Shakespeare. You've got to do the runs, you've got to do the boat, you've got to do the fire service, you've got to do the whole lot. I personally would find that really hard, because as I've admitted, I hated PE, and I would really, but my goodness, would it have been good for my character. So everyone has to do everything. And like we found compulsory dance, that's something they all have to do at Gordonstoun, so they have to look stupid in front of their peers or brilliant in front of their peers or whatever, but everyone has to do everything. So you don't have the cool people doing this and the rubbish people doing that. So that practice of having to have a go, potentially having to have a go a lot of times and still be rubbish, but that being okay, because you've seen, and we did this very interesting subcut, because the school went mixed in the 70s, and so we got some quite good data on women. And of course, what happens to the women is they have an incredibly steady confidence, which you don't get in the kind of more bookish girls' academies, because they have seen themselves be both better and worse than men on the sports field, in the classroom, on the boat, volunteering, up a mountain, doing whatever it is. So they know that they're better and worse in a whole variety of ways. So when they meet these chaps at work, they're just quite cool about it. They're quite steady about what they're good at and what they're not good at, and whether this person is good or not. And that meant that the career data on these women, in terms of what they told us that they'd been able to do, a lot of them had made very different choices in careers, but for those who had to go through those kind of male environments, they had a very deployed confidence that's quite unusual. So my head of music saw the data and said, well, I don't think I'm serving you, because actually we only do pretty much a concert a term, and if actually this is about heart rate and pressure and performance and resilience and templating. So they then started introducing these weekly concerts where these kids have to sort of get their bagpipes or whatever, and there's other kids there, there's parents there, there's peers, there's people they're trying to impress, there's teachers, and of course, if our biggest fear as grown-ups is public speaking, no person at Gordonstoun is ever going to be terrified of public speaking, are they? Because they've been absolutely through the mill, but in a really supportive environment where everyone is doing the same thing. And that stuff, I think, is readily transferable into any educational environment, and would really, really help us if we could institutionalize that a bit more.
Gosh, so many places to ask you more about that we don't have time for. We're on the home straight here with my questions, last clutch of them. So back to capitalism. So I spent 10 years in financial services, and when I start doing my research and reading my drawing on for theological critiques of capitalism, Anglo-Catholic sources, and sometimes wanted to throw some of the books across the room at the naivety and one research seminar I was involved in, getting Christian economists in a room with theologians, and you just realize, oil and water, you guys don't know how the real world works. And so, and I did have a lot of sympathy for that, and I sense that in your work as well. Just because you've studied the way that some Cistercians behave with regards to money doesn't mean you can replace capitalism with it in the present day. Just that utter naivety. So what's your orientation towards capitalism, having a PhD? Because I think it would be safe to assume a lot of people, when they see that your research area was theology and capitalism, would assume that you would have not just been critical of it, but would probably be suggesting it's had its time and we need to get rid of it and replace it with something. That's what most theologians tend to overreach for.
So a couple of vignettes on this. I applied to do my doctorate at Oxford. I had a very polite refusal on the basis that a PhD is supposed to be about either defending a hero or prosecuting a villain. And, capitalism there's no point to that subject. Equally, I was rejected by St Andrews University because the faculty would have ethical issues supervising me. I was bound to be pro-capitalist and they didn't approve of that. So it was incredibly hard to find anywhere to do my doctorate. And in the end, I managed to persuade Richard Higginson from Ridley Hall to do it in Cambridge. Because he has got a foot in the business world and does understand that it can come from a very good place and frequently does. And so he didn't have the kind of ideological blinkers theologians do. But as you say, it was a bit like, I studied Islam at university and there was nothing. There was lots of books about Mohammedanism in the library that had been written in the 1800s, but there wasn't any data because in those days there just wasn't any scholarship on it. There's so little thinking of any quality on theology and capitalism. It's really embarrassing. As you say, most of it you have to filter out 80% of it because they're just flying kites and talking hogwash. So I came at it to try and solve that problem, which is, why did I feel probably more comfortable in the city than I did in the church? Why did I see better behavior in the city quite often than I did in the church? Was there something? Were we going towards a big iceberg? And was there a way to stop that? And why did I feel there was still something not quite in kilter about the system? So I wasn't trying to destroy capitalism. I was trying to redeem it. And I was trying to explain it in a way that would raise our literacy, because the thing that I came up against really quickly was that slightly snotty, oh, you're just a girl who's a theologian, what do you know about economics? The sort of thing you get when IT people tell you not to worry your silly little head about code. And you get that with any sort of protected, discipline. But I was hopping mad about it because economics is incredibly gendered and very intellectually snotty about maths and a whole lot of other stuff. And which is really stupid, actually, intellectually, because there's a whole load of bits that economics has just missed because they've been so metrical about everything. And so I knew, I'm quite dogged and quite stubborn, and I knew I was onto something because I have learned to trust my gut, and I knew that I had something important to say about some of these rules. And that was because of a couple of things I've come up against, not only the sort of template stuff I talked about, but I'd come up against things like agency theory on my MBA, where there was this idea that the workers were recalcitrant and needed to be forced into alignment by various complicated maneuvers around property and shareholders and, all classical stuff. That's why I had to have trade unions to fight back, and HR policies to control. And I knew that was anti-Christian, essentially, in terms of our vision of humanity and what we think people are here for and how they're wired. So I thought there's probably quite a lot more stuff like that. And I'd picked up through some of the work I'd done at Ashridge the looming problem about externalities, particularly around environmental cost. So I knew that there were lots of things that weren't quite right. And I just wondered if I, with my rather idiosyncratic pair of spectacles, could spot things other people might not have the vantage point to see. And so the reason I wrote Toxic Assumptions in the way I did, in a very accessible way, it is a way of just trying to teach economics to people that need to know about it so we can fight back, because actually there are things wrong with it. It's not that the capitalism is entirely moribund, although it could be if we don't change the rules. It's not like the concept is wrong. It's just that some of the rules are wrong. And those are things we can change, but we need to stop being told to go and sit over in the corner and do our knitting and behave ourselves about it.
Definitely. As I say, back at near the beginning of this interview, when I was looking at evangelicalism and capitalism, I had advanced financial planning certificates, and I just knew instinctively the issues that I'm trying to wrestle with are not about the technical nature, which is why your work was so helpful, and my examiners accepted it as the frame for which I could talk about capitalism in terms of its social relationships and how it works relationally. And for me, found that underneath capitalism, obviously cultures of consumerism that concern me more, but then the mechanism of commodification, what that does to belief and practice that was a place I landed very concerned. And I must admit, got to the end of the project, and my project was to try to own all the problems of co-option from evangelical faith and spirituality around the worst of those things. But got to the end of it, and it was, I must admit, every theological source that I read, reached for, at best, issues of desire, habit, curriculum, formation. But sort of the punchline to all of them was this despondency that the pernicious nature of commodified practices in consumer cultures is such that, what Christianity invites you into for habit and formation can't compete with it, really. Or as James K.A. Smith, the theologian, mentioned, he talked about sitting on the sofa with his teenage son, and the American Super Bowl comes on and Budweiser advert and Victoria's Secrets, and he's like, how does the best of Christian practices ever compete with what's offered here?
But that's why I'm so cross, and I'm sure you are as well, because we haven't been bloody trying.
That's what I want to ask you. So what do we do?
We are the people that ought to be totally on this, because we know about formation, we know about virtue, and we know about the perils of, the tractor beam pulling us off towards mammon and away from God. And we've just been crap, because as you say, all these people have been keeping their heads down, going Marxism, and I'm not getting tooled up, which is why I decided I was bloody well going to get tooled up on this, because it just feels like it's laziness. There's a whole load of people who just will not put the time in to get on top of this stuff, and it's too important. And the Consumerism book, it's a funny old book. It was commissioned because it was basically a kind of Eve's greatest hits to try and turn the thing into a more specific Christian offering. And all that pastoral stuff at the end is to try and help people have these conversations. Just my acid test with this is when I talk to people about their bank statements and I ask them who they'd be happy to show it to. And there are very few people that would put it on the internet or share it in church, or even share it with their spouse half the time, which is really interesting. So there's some really basic stuff that Christians need to come to terms with about their own relationship with money, and not hide behind ideologies to sort of pretend that's fine. Because money is a gift, it's a spirit, it's an energy that we've been given by God, and helped to be able to have money or not by our circumstances and backgrounds and stuff. And we should be deploying all the resources we've got and not imagining that's someone else's problem. And so, the consumerism stuff, I totally agree. I think it is about desire. And I think a lot of the anti-consumerism stuff that's been written is very gloomy, because it's basically saying their technologies of desire are better than ours. Well, are they, Buffalo? It's just that we're not deploying the ones we've got. And so there's something about just trying to get really clear about what particularly consumerism, not so much capitalism, because consumerism is sort of software that's kind of, well, it's like putting the whole thing on a smartphone. It kind of goes bananas. It's about consumerism is about creating newness that you want to acquire so that you can compete with other people. So you acquire that new thing, and the second you've acquired it, it's become old. So you've got to acquire the next new thing. And so it puts you on this ratchet, which of course can only end up in one place. And it is utterly hopeless. And it is promising you something which it can't deliver. If only you buy this Coke, you will become young and beautiful. If only you buy this Gap outfit or this movie or whatever, you'll be like all these other beautiful people who are totally happy. And we know intellectually that's absolute hogwash. But if you look at the kind of mechanics and the neurobiology of choice, when we have this much information, we have to go with role models because it's quicker in terms of heuristics. And if all our role models are like pop stars and people are basically being paid to flog products that actually they might not go for themselves, we end up just rather sleepwalking our way into patterns of repetitive behavior that themselves become habits. And then we become, we just feed the machine. And so I just get cross because I just sort of think we all, as Christians and people who care about children, should be trying to find other healthier habits. And there's been a lot of stuff about trying to not buy stuff, buy experiences, buy presents, buy gifts, buy charitable. There's lots of ways we can start weaning the system towards our goals. We've seen that through fair trade. We see that in lots of ways. It's a bit like judo. You don't need to fight this. You can use its weight, its strength, its incredible sophistication in a better way, but you need to understand it before you can get involved. So really, I just think that, yourself from, theological colleges, the curriculum is so narrow and it doesn't give you life skills. And actually, whenever you're ministering to people who are living in the world and are subject to all of the wiles of the world. And unless we really understand those wiles, how can we fight them? It's just not all about sex. It's actually much more about consumerism these days.
It is. I agree with you. So this, that I think there's an educational piece of unmasking perverted liturgies of consumer culture, just so we can see, there's no excuse. Okay. Oh gosh, I had no idea. Then there's the competing liturgy aspect, things that are more affective that shape us. But for me, that I guess where I ended up was the place of, it's like, it's that place and space. Maybe it's a Christological piece for me that I never got to do in my work. It was beyond it, but a belief in identity information. So the battle of agency that takes place in consumer culture, that beyond effectiveness in education, that there is an encounter with Jesus Christ that is at the heart of the gospel that says, you will never become who you were meant to be. No human being has ever plumbed the depths of what they were meant to be in Jesus Christ. That's the place. So self-creation is exhausting. Comparing yourselves to pop stars is exhausting. This making of yourself. I'm reaching for that still in my postdoctoral world of how through Christian worship, instead of this, that's naughty, don't do that, this is more virtuous, to tap into that deep desire that's underneath all that comparison to say, yes, but wouldn't you really like to become the person you would
faster, but run towards God. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's all that our hearts are restless till they find their rest in thee, and Rowan Williams stuff about we've just got to grow up. When there's not some neat gap that this product is going to fill, that's not God's vision. But it is just trying to re-find our voice on that and try and work out what technologies we've got that we've just been underselling. I think a lot of people worry when I talk about things like that I'm trying to sort of turn the church into sort of consumerism itself or a kind of capitalist system. That's not really what I mean. It's just that we're the global experts, the people of faith, all the world traditions, the faith traditions are the experts in formation. And we've been at this a lot longer than consumerism has been around. And instead of just throwing our hands up in the air and going, Mechti me, we've just got to roll up our sleeves and get on with it. Maybe this will be the thing that'll kill us all stone dead, but we don't know that, do we?
Brilliant. So your all your work and your methodologies, you mentioned obviously this is a leadership book, but are you lensing this into any Christian leadership environments, and are you taking the methods behind this into issues of discipleship, or is anybody extending your work into those areas?
Well, funnily enough, of course, Leadersmithing wasn't written as a specifically Christian book. Both of those books were Bloomsbury quite deliberately rather than a Christian publisher. But, from looking at the Amazon, people who bought this stats, clergy seem to be buying it a lot and have been ever since it came out. So I have spent quite a lot of time talking to dioceses, groups of clergy and study days and things. We haven't got as far as we'd like to on it, because one of the things that I try and do when I was doing this at Ashridge, one of the things I do with each new industry or company was get them to re-ask the question of their own leaders. So, if you ask the Foreign Office or you ask the board of Tesco, what do you know now you wish you known 10 years ago? The perennials are the same, but you get a slightly different flavour. And imagine if you ask a vicar, a seasoned vicar, they'll say things like first funeral of a child, first time a homeless person broke in the middle of my thing and started trashing the place. There's some pivotal things that happen when you're, running a church. Big fight in the PCC meeting, whatever it might be. They might be generic things about handling conflict, difficult conversations, blah, 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 handling extreme emotion. But there'll be a particularity to them in a kind of Christian context that needs to be paid attention to. So one of the things I'd love, and I mean, maybe it's something I'll do myself at some point, is to do a sort of version of this, which is what I wish I'd known 10 years ago, particularly in the church, to try and nuance this a bit and pack in more explicitly theological resources, which you wouldn't normally do in a book like this in a secular context, because I think they are implicit in the book, but maybe not explicit. But I think the thing is that I'm also very concerned at the moment about robot souls. So I'm trying to decide whether I do more on leadership, particularly around things like Christian leadership and women in leadership, or whether I'm supposed to be writing a book on that, because I do feel that, again, we're the people that know about souls, and because other people don't know about souls, they're not paying attention to consciousness when they're thinking about artificial intelligence, and they're regarding an awful lot of stuff we think is precious as junk code. So they're making crap humans because they don't really understand those bits. And so I'm quite interested in how we can bring Christian resources to bear on that, because that's another area which is wholly secular, really. And even the ethics being deployed is about utilitarianism and not about anything deeper than that. So I'm not quite sure which way I'll go yet.
Oh, well, that was going to be my last question, asking what you're doing next, but you just answered that. So, I mean, with these 17 things, do you think they would be do you think it would be radically different? And if the playing cards that you produced, I've got to ask you about how they work. Would there be a different set of playing cards on Amazon for the Christian?
Religious use? The 17 are quite generic. I mean, we asked people over a period of about 10 years from loads of different organizations across the world. So the fact that they were so incredibly consistent makes me think they are probably just about humans rather than contexts. And they're all things like stepping up, decision making, managing ambiguity, difficult conversations, managing the numbers. It's not stuff that's very specific, actually, but it is all kind of key mastery practices that you've got to nail in terms of standard operating procedures. So then how do you deploy them in an environment where you're taking a child's funeral or you're having a fight with your church wardens or whatever? That's a sort of second order set of skills. So the cards, which are just a set of, back end of the book is separated out as a pack of cards, and so I've delivered them as a card pack so that you can literally take out. This one is an exercise called Missing Person, which is about trying to imagine that if you had a twin or a job share or whatever that completed you, what would they be like, and how can you borrow some of those gifts and skills if you're having a bad day? There's a whole load of stuff in here which is just sort of, some of it's sort of angel cards for sort of emergencies, some of it is about addressing particular weaknesses or challenges that you've got. And I think what would be different about it, I mean, I think I would be more explicit about the resourcing you need around prayer and around some of the disciplines, about being very, very clear about the why and the what, around our faith behind all of this. And it helps with a lot of these things, because one of the really difficult things for leaders is that when you are the boss and you're making decisions in acute uncertainty, as such we have this year, the dice will roll and those decisions won't always be perfect. And what do you do if you sacked a load of people the week before they announced furlough and you just ruined everyone's lives? And actually, you didn't know the government were going to change their mind on this. How do you live with yourself? And of course, if you don't have any faith disciplines, if you don't have any inner life, it's very hard to do that. And that's when it gets internalized as bad behaviors and dependencies and crutches and all that kind of stuff we know about. So, there are some very deep resources Christians have about sin and about expiation and about bearing burdens and about apologies and forgiveness and, a whole lot of stuff that we have vocabularies for that actually the secular world could learn a lot from, but, at least we've got. And also ambiguity and uncertainty. Faith, by definition, is a leap. We don't know. We can imagine that we know by the odd experience we have of God or Jesus or something, but of course we don't really know. So we're quite used to that. We're quite used to just hoping and doing the right things that would kind of reinforce that hope and allow us to express that hope with other people. So we should be naturally better leaders than many other people because of some of the theological resources we've got. And so it's helping us see that and learn from it and connect the dots of it, and deploy those skills, I think, more comprehensively.
I must admit to being very disappointed with you, and unless I missed it, I get to the appendices and I get, I can fill in the boxes here, and I'm like, why do you not have some online Leadersmithing psychometric test for £15 to take and do all this?
Well, I am having a few conversations about that because I did this thing. I was off having the twins. I didn't have any resources. So I was going to try and turn the whole thing into an app, but you need quite a lot of money for that. But it does feel like the sort of thing you could turn into something which was a very helpful prompt, that when you've got a difficult meeting coming up, it would serve you up some things to think about and some things to practice. So again, it is something I may well do. I'm speaking to some partners about that, because it is the fruits of all my work at Ashridge. And I mean, everything behind this is a session, it's a course, it's the difficult conversations thing. You do that, you get a load of actors in and you go through scenarios of all your nemesis and your worst nightmares until you're not afraid of them anymore. So pretty much all of this stuff, you could turn the whole thing into a business school, really, and you'd be minted.
You could, yes, you could. I was thinking you could integrate this into the Apple Watch, so people have the templating experience in the moment.
My ring's going up. Good learning.
Phone says, "Okay, template 3," and you.
But I think one of the things I think is a real blessing about this, particularly when I talk to Christians about it, is that there's a lot of shame and regret in our lives. There's a lot of things where we think we've let people down and we've got it wrong, and it's been a disaster. And actually what Leadersmithing teaches you is that's all templates, and you can turn these into such blessings because they're your resources and they're your knots in the wood and they're the soundtrack of your life. And it is very redemptive. It's about using everything that God's given you and trying to just deploy that really well. Yeah.
Well, if you've got the stamina, I'll ask you last questions on COVID-19. And you've, I believe from what we've managed to glean online, you're mooting the idea of a universal basic income for a year. And you've traced that back to Thomas More's political satire Utopia in 1516. Could you tell us a little bit more about that UBI and what its purposes might be?
The thing about the playing fields of Eton is you don't meet very many normal people, and an awful lot of public policy assumes a degree of poverty which is sort of acceptable. So people who have part-time jobs, or jobs as cleaners or something. So most of the manoeuvres around, the furlough schemes and whatever assume employment. And we already know universal credit isn't working on the ground. We already know that even before COVID, the food bank thing was an absolute national scandal. And of course, what's happened through COVID is the middle classes are all a bit stressed about Zoom, but actually have probably made money. It's the precariat, it's all the people who fall between the cracks, who have been left out of all these solutions. And because the charities are also really broken, they're not in a great place to help them. So I was asked by the Jubilee Centre to look into debt and household debt and what should policy responses be to household debt, with coronavirus having, made that much worse. When I looked at debt, I went back to this really great finding that when Justice Welby took on the war against Wonga and they did some analysis of doorstep loans, they found that the average was about 280 quid or something. And most of the loans were things like school uniform and shoes and Christmas presents. I mean, it wasn't for Rolex watches and, drugs around the corner. It was for your fridge breaking, and it was for paying your rent because your husband hadn't worked for a week because he'd broken his leg or whatever. This wasn't people mucking about because of consumerism. This was like serious hardship. And it occurred to us then that 300 quid as a cushion would stop most people having to go anywhere near a loan shark. So when I started building on that and thinking how much worse it's got because of payment holidays are only going to be suddenly a massive avalanche of debt hitting people post-Christmas when the redundancies also hit. I started thinking we need to just get money out. I mean, if you think about money in the system, and again, this is why it's quite helpful to have a very generic view of these things like I do. The money's in the system or not. Either it's going out through credits, or it's going out through payments, or it's going out through, whatever. It's all swishing around. So what the government wants is they want a few things to happen. They want some spending to happen to help the high street recover. They want that to be in the real economy rather than just being squirreled away in banks through sort of loan repayments and stuff. They want charities to keep being helpful. They want as few people as possible to claim benefits, but obviously that's available if they have to. There's a whole load of things, policy objectives that you would have. And it occurred to me that the single best policy intervention to solve all of these problems would be a year of universal basic income, because it would give people a cushion. Now, okay, there might need to be some correction because of coronavirus, but in general, it would give people a cushion. For the people who don't actually need the money, it would get rid of food banks. So a basic amount of money would actually allow you to feed your family. Hallelujah. If you fed your family, then you could save it as a cushion. If you're rich and you don't need the money, you'll give it to charity, and that saves the charity sector. If you're a creative person who's an artist or a musician who's on a sort of therefore gig economy sort of thing, you can still be creative, and we keep that sector going. It just seems to me a total no-brainer. Of course, the problem is that while there's universal political support, there isn't political support in the Conservative Party, because the whips are saying it's universal credit or nothing, and we can't do anything that would be seen to undermine it. And of course, the programme we're all suggesting for a year of it, a bit like the furlough scheme, is because that addresses two problems. One of the problems is that nobody wants to do it because they don't want to be the bad guys that undo it. But if you're doing it during COVID, you can make it time bound. So that resolves the political problem. And the other reason you wouldn't normally do it is you're not quite sure how to finance it, but you could easily finance it through things like the tax credits we already get, or a very small uptake on income tax. And given that so many of the middle classes have actually saved money through not commuting and buying lunch at Pret and stuff, that probably would be absorbable. So it actually would be a policy window. It would be a moment in time when you can get away with it, which would also then give us the data we'd need to test it properly, because it's never actually been done properly. So one of the reasons not to do it is because we don't know. This would give us the data we'd need to be able to figure out if this is an intervention we should do more permanently or not. So it's tricky, because I sort of feel dead strongly about it, but you can't just get the Tory party to change its mind on this kind of thing. I'm hoping there's enough of a head of steam amongst the other politicians that this would be a risk worth taking. And to be honest, if I was a Conservative politician at the moment, they've got a massive image problem. They were trying. One thing they always say, David Cameron said, is do not attack the international aid budget, because then we will become the nasty party again. So they've become the nasty party again. If you were being really Dominic Cummings about it, you would bribe the electorate by giving them free money through universal basic income, because then all of a sudden everyone would love the Tories. So I think it would be a very shrewd manoeuvre. But
an extension of the furlough scheme, turning points in history to try things out. It does feel like a right moment to. It's
right. The citizens have behaved really well, and I think there's a deal here about citizens. And I think a citizen income, to say thanks for staying indoors and not infecting everyone, generally behaving well apart from a few exceptions. Here's a bit of money to see you right again, and then let's take a breath afterwards and see where we are.
Yeah, put money back in the economy. Just as a little anecdote observation, vignette from my own life, when I've had various people, more of a right-leaning persuasion against universal basic income, I've often pointed out the fact that if it wasn't for their wealthy parents who effectively gave them a enormous basic income to get through life, and it didn't make them indolent and lazy and non-aspirational, I've never bought the moral hazard.
That deserving and undeserving poor thing. I mean, William Temple would be so behind this, which is why when I write about it in the Church Times, it's all about, this is our William Temple moment. Last time we did the NHS, what are we going to do now? We need to do something, because this country is not right in terms of the sheer volume of people who are desperately hungry and mentally and physically unwell and not housed, not clothed. It's an absolute scandal that a country of this status should have such a desperate problem, and that's political.
And leadership, isn't it, at the end of the day? Last COVID question, almost done. Do you think, assuming post-COVID recessions and all the challenges that are yet to come, that the affordability of higher education means that the way we fund education has to change? Or do we need more vocational apprentice-based learning that we had managed to get rid of, didn't we, before?
I love you. This is exactly where I am on this. I mean, there has to be a massive correction. I know what Tony Blair was up to, but it was really stupid to make everybody go to university, because it's not for everyone. It's frankly not that very useful for very many jobs. But when you change the economy the way it has, everyone's now got to have about 55 degrees before they can even clean the floor. It's batty. And it's also commodifying education. And you wouldn't do theology now, because what would you do with it? Which is why it's all about vicar training now, not about education. So there has to be a massive correction. And as you can tell from the title Leadersmithing, I'm very keen on apprenticeships. And I think it's a real shame that the government are trying to address that, as the previous government did. But there's become this stigma now because of that policy intervention around everyone has to be university and everyone has to go to one. Everyone's got a 2-1, so, you know, what's yours worth? So I think there does need to be a massive shake-up. I think a lot of that will end up being led by companies. Because when I speak to companies, I mean, again, a place like Gordonstoun, we're trying to have those conversations already, which is, you know, what do you want from your employees, and how do we help them plan what they need to do within school and beyond school to get those jobs? Because ultimately that's really what this is all about. You know, whatever that job might be. And employees are fed up. They don't think these degrees are worth anything. They don't think they're getting useful people. They're just getting indebted people who've come to work for them for all the wrong reasons, because they're just in hock. And again, in terms of the student loan thing, has been an absolute disaster, because it in terms of this consumerism culture, it turns 16 to 18-year-olds into consumers and people who've got deals with the state and taking out loans at a very early age, and gets them onto that loan ladder way before they need to have habits of debt. And then they get pushed into jobs that will allow them to pay off the loan, rather than jobs that might be useful, good use of their skills and their calling and their talents. And so I do feel the whole thing needs a massive shakeout. We need to close down half the universities, or turn the polys back into polys. We need to start a lot more on the job schemes, genuine ones that really work and aren't taking the mickey. And we need to just write off all student loans and stop mucking about on that front, because that will come back through taxation anyway, if you're sensible.
Well, Eve Poole for Prime Minister. or Rishi Sunak, watch out. We can but hope. Well, Eve, we're right at the end of this interview. Time has flown by. It's been an absolute privilege to talk to you. Is there anything else you're working on at the moment that you know about?
It is the robot souls stuff. I have a notion about that, you see, because we're terribly worried about the future. And the whole thing about leadersmithing was to try and get 2020 foresight from 2020 hindsight. And so we're just getting into a period of worry about artificial intelligence and robots stealing our jobs, and, you know, what all that means and all that stuff. But we know the future, because the great thing about sci-fi, which I didn't really know about until I married my lovely husband, is that they've written all, starting from Utopia forward, really, all these books tell us about the future, and they have between them mapped out pretty much every possible future. You know, if you get on top of the genre and start looking at robots win, humans win, hybrid, whatever, we know that stuff. So why are we not taking that seriously and developing ethical tracks around that? So, you know, if we are going to have the robots as a subclass, what does that mean in terms of our rules? Without us being speciesist, have we got any right to be special as humans? What does that mean? The only actual argument we've got for our speciality is that God made us, which isn't an argument that normal people would accept in terms of public policy and rules of a state. So there's some really interesting questions for Christians there about, are we in, it's a bit like capitalism. We're not in the conversations, and we need to be. We know a lot about souls, we know a lot about consciousness, but we also know a thing or two about creation and co-creation, and what the rules ought to be around that. So I'm very curious about how we can use the teaching from sort of the sci-fi genre to start tracking back to what are the ethical dilemmas and questions that we need to start addressing now, so that cars aren't designed to kill the wrong people, or, you know, we start getting in earlier. We probably missed the boat on some of that stuff, but there's still time, I think, because that feels to be the next big geopolitical question, apart from the environment and all that other stuff, is what do we do about us as a species in terms of our future?
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Eve. That is the end of our interview, and we'll make sure, as they say, in the show notes, so in the links to the interview, we'll have links to you and where people can get your books and go to your website, find out more about you and what you're doing and stuff. Thank you for this long-ranging interview in terms of time and topics, and thank you. I've absolutely enjoyed today, and I wish it could have been longer. So many more things we'd love to talk to you about. So thank you, and we wish you all the best with all the great projects that you're involved in. Thank you. Great. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed that, and we have many other interviews with amazing guests where we listen attentively and respectfully to discover people's backstories through their beliefs and life experiences, and find out what shaped them into who they are and inspires what they do. You can catch all those interviews by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find audio versions in your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, etc. Just search Extra ECC. Of course, you can go to extraecc.com and sign up for our newsletter and find all our social media links and more. And by the way, all links are in our show notes below.